Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The Great Train Lantern Switcheroo of 1883. On a moonless winter evening in February of 1883, the iron rails stretching across Pennsylvania hummed under the weight of distant engines. In the late 19th century, America's railways were more than transportation. They were the lifeblood of industry, commerce, and communication. Freight moved by horse and wagon within towns, but for steel, coal, and the restless surge of people westward, the train was the only artery that mattered. And yet, these arteries were controlled not by telegraph operators in faraway cities, nor by a central dispatch, but by something far more fragile: lanterns, held in human hands, swinging in coded motions, trusted to stop thousands of tons of moving steel. You can imagine the scene. A conductor leans from the side of a car, holding aloft a kerosene lantern whose flame fights the cold night air. The glass globe glows green, meaning all is clear. A red lantern swung across the track signals danger. White lights beckon a train to proceed cautiously, while small changes in the angle, motion, or height of the swing carry their own distinct meanings. The entire safety of a railway line, hundreds of passengers, freight worth fortunes, and the very engines themselves depended on the honesty and attentiveness of men with lanterns. In 1883, on the main line of the Pennsylvania Railroad near Harrisburg, someone decided to exploit that fragility. The context of the switcheroo. The newspapers would later call it the lantern switcheroo, though the incident was rarely given front-page treatment. It was not as bloody as a robbery gone wrong, nor as sensational as the outlaws who derailed trains out west. Instead, it was quieter, subtler, and in its way more dangerous. Because unlike a stick-up or a dynamite blast, a lantern signal could redirect an entire train into the wrong siding, where thieves or saboteurs might wait. And on that particular February night, a passenger express, barreling eastward from Pittsburgh toward Philadelphia, was guided by false lights into precisely such a trap. But before we examine the moment of the crime itself, we need to understand the environment in which it happened. Trains were frequent targets for thieves in the late 19th century. Bandits on horseback might chase a slow-moving freight, forcing it to halt while they climbed aboard. More organized gangs preferred subtle methods: bribed station agents, stolen keys to baggage cars, or knowledge of schedules. In most cases, rail companies could respond with Pinkerton detectives, armed guards, and vigilance. But the lantern system, that was harder to defend. It was both too visible and too vulnerable. Any man with a red lantern could, in theory, stop a train. And in the lantern switcheroo of 1883, that simple fact was weaponized. The first reports. The Harrisburg Patriot, dated February 16, 1883, carried the first account. Buried in the middle pages, the article spoke of a passenger train that had been diverted from its rightful line by the false exhibition of signals, occasioning delay and confusion. The story was written in the understated language of the time. There was no mention of robbery or sabotage, only malicious interference. But in private correspondence between railroad officials, which later surfaced in company archives, the language was far stronger. One superintendent wrote, "It is no small mischief, but a deliberate stratagem to lay hold of our cars for purposes unlawful. Lanterns were switched at the siding near Derry, and an express diverted, its conductor helpless to discern the falsehood until too late." What then was the motive? Was it robbery, sabotage, or the reckless amusement of pranksters, unaware or uncaring of the potential for catastrophe? Lantern codes and human trust. To understand the vulnerability, we need to picture the lantern codes as they existed in the 1880s. Railroads had printed manuals. Green meant proceed, red meant stop, and white meant back. But the meaning of lanterns was also shaped by habit and local custom. In some yards, a lantern swung in a full circle might mean all clear. In others, it might mean break. These signals were taught apprentice style, passed from conductor to brakeman, with variations creeping in from line to line. This looseness created an opportunity. If a stranger were to stand by the siding at night, holding up a lantern with confidence, a conductor could easily mistake it for legitimate instruction. Remember, trains could not stop quickly. An engineer might see a red lantern ahead and apply the brakes, but by then the train would already be committed to a siding. Once the mistake was realized, it might be too late. This was precisely what happened in February 1883. The express train from Pittsburgh was diverted at the Derry siding. Waiting in the shadows, men slipped aboard the baggage car, broke open a shipment of parcels, and made off with several bags before slipping into the countryside. The theft was small in value, perhaps only a few $100s worth of goods, but the principle terrified railroad men. Early suspects. In the weeks that followed, investigators focused on two groups of suspects. The first was local farmhands. The countryside near Derry was populated with tenant farmers and day laborers, many of whom resented the railroad. Livestock were often frightened or killed by passing trains, and compensation was rarely fair. Lanterns were common farm tools, so it was plausible that young men had staged the diversion as either a prank or petty revenge. The second group under suspicion were dismissed railway employees. Railroads hired and fired with little ceremony. A brakeman dismissed for drinking might still possess his lantern, his knowledge of signals, and his grudges. Pinkerton detectives working the case quietly noted that several former employees had been seen in taverns boasting of their knowledge of how to stop any train at will. But while suspicion abounded, evidence did not. Lantern light revealed little about the bearer's identity. By the time company men scoured the siding, the culprits had vanished. A fragile system exposed. The Great Lantern Switcheroo was not the only such crime, but it was among the first to make railway executives confront the weakness of their signaling system. It forced them to ask questions that had long been avoided. How much of rail safety was really dependent on unverified signals? Could a stranger with a lamp truly redirect thousands of lives? For passengers, the incident was barely noticed. Few papers covered it in any detail. There were no fatalities, no wreckage, no dramatic holdups with six-shooters. But among the men who ran the railroads, it was a wake-up call. Within weeks, company circulars were issued, instructing engineers to be wary of lantern signals not issued by known station agents. And in some regions, colored lantern globes were changed, or codes modified, in the hope of making forgery less likely. The quiet spread of fear. What made the lantern switcheroo so unsettling was its quietness. It had no heroes and no dramatic climax. The train was simply misled, the thieves simply vanished, and the crime left behind nothing but unease. If it could happen once, it could happen again. And while this incident ended with only minor theft, the potential for disaster was plain. Imagine a freight loaded with dynamite, diverted into a passenger siding by false lights. Imagine two expresses meeting head-on in the darkness, all because a lantern was switched. Railroads were beginning to modernize in 1883. Telegraph lines paralleled most major routes, allowing dispatchers to send orders directly to stations. But lanterns remained the frontline communication tool in yards, sidings, and on the tracks themselves. They were visible, immediate, and trusted. And that trust in 1883 was cracked. The lingering mystery. The culprits were never caught. Rumors persisted for years afterward, that it had been a disgruntled brakeman, that it had been a gang of local youths, that it was even an inside job by railway staff eager to highlight the system's weaknesses. But the truth was never established. And so the lantern switcheroo of 1883 passed into the half-forgotten annals of railway lore, not as a great robbery or a bloody wreck, but as a quiet reminder of how fragile human systems can be and how small acts can unsettle vast enterprises. But here is the question that lingers still. If the culprits were never found, And if lanterns remained the basis of railway safety for decades afterward, how many other switcheroos may have occurred, unnoticed, unreported, or quietly suppressed by companies unwilling to admit their vulnerability? The aftermath of the lantern switcheroo did not bring immediate clarity. Instead, it brought unease, a creeping awareness that the mighty Pennsylvania Railroad, with its sprawling depots, its hundreds of locomotives, and its well-drilled crews, could be undone by nothing more than a glass globe and a flickering flame. For a corporation that prided itself on efficiency, discipline, and modernity, this was unacceptable. And so, scarcely a week after the February 1883 incident, the company reached for its most trusted weapon in matters of secrecy and sabotage: the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Enter the Pinkertons. The Pinkertons by then were legendary. Founded in the 1850s by Allan Pinkerton, the agency had built its reputation protecting railroads, breaking up counterfeit rings, and even foiling an alleged assassination plot against President Lincoln. By the 1880s, they were synonymous with private justice. Wherever labor unrest simmered, wherever trains were robbed, wherever crimes threatened capital, Pinkerton men appeared. In the Harrisburg switcheroo, the agency was tasked with uncovering culprits swiftly and quietly. The railroad could not afford to publicize its vulnerability, nor could it allow passengers to suspect that their safety depended on the honesty of shadows along the line. Pinkerton detectives were sworn to secrecy, their reports marked confidential, their correspondence delivered in coded envelopes. The first order of business: identify motive. Was this a petty theft that spiraled into something more elaborate, or was it deliberate sabotage aimed at shaking public confidence? Following the lanterns, detectives began their work with the lanterns themselves. Every brakeman and station hand was issued a standard kerosene lantern, fitted with colored glass. Pinkerton men inspected dozens of lanterns, tracking serial numbers and comparing them to the one reported by witnesses at the Derry sighting. One engineer swore he had seen the telltale glow of a green lantern, but brighter than usual, too bright for regulation oil. Another recalled that the signals appeared shaky, as if the bearer were unused to holding the lamp aloft during train approach. Still another remembered nothing at all, except the unnerving sensation of being guided into a siding that should have been empty. The inconsistencies frustrated investigators, but one detail stuck. A farmhand claimed to have found a discarded lantern globe near a hedgerow not far from the siding. It was cracked, soot-stained, and most unusual painted with a layer of green dye that had seeped unevenly into the glass. It was not a standard railway lantern globe. This suggested improvisation. Someone had tried to counterfeit the appearance of a legitimate signal light. Suspects close to home. The first serious suspects were indeed local men. Derry and the surrounding countryside were home to farmers who had long felt at odds with the Pennsylvania Railroad. Crops were damaged by sparks from engines. Wells sometimes ran dry after cuttings were blasted through limestone, and livestock had been struck down on the tracks. Detectives interviewed dozens of young men in taverns, asking carefully whether anyone had been seen near the siding on that February night. A name surfaced again and again: Thomas Hanlon, a 20-year-old farm laborer known for his reckless streak. Hanlon was said to have boasted about knowing how to turn the trains, though when questioned, he dismissed it as tavern talk. Yet Hanlon had no lantern, no accomplices, and perhaps most importantly, no way to profit from the parcels stolen from the baggage car. The theft had included items bound for dry goods stores in Philadelphia: bolts of cloth, small tools, a few parcels of letters. Nothing that a farmhand could sell easily in rural Pennsylvania. The detectives began to look elsewhere. Dismissed railroad men. A new lead emerged in March 1883 when Pinkerton reports noted the presence of a former brakeman, dismissed from the line for habitual drinking, living not far from Derry. His name was James "Jimmy" Caro. Caro was known to possess his old lantern, and he had a grudge against his former employers. He also had a history of petty theft. Neighbors claimed Caro had been seen walking late at night near the tracks, carrying a lantern. When questioned, he admitted to walking the line but denied any involvement in the switcheroo. Pinkertons pressed harder, pointing out that he had once bragged in a tavern that no train can run without me, whether they know it or not. Caro held firm. No evidence linked him directly to the stolen parcels, which had disappeared entirely. He was a convenient suspect, but not a convincing one. Copycat crimes. While investigators wrestled with uncertainty, a troubling pattern emerged. By April 1883, 2 more trains in different states reported unusual lantern signals. In Ohio, a freight was delayed for several hours after being guided into a siding by a false light. In Illinois, a passenger train nearly collided with a stationary freight when a lantern signaled it onto the wrong track. In both cases, the perpetrators vanished before anyone could identify them. But the similarity of the incidents was unmistakable. Someone or several someones had realized that the very system designed to protect rail traffic could be turned into a weapon. For the Pennsylvania Railroad executives, this was a nightmare. What had seemed a local incident now looked like the beginning of a dangerous trend. Pinkerton agents began expanding their inquiry, sharing notes with railroads across state lines, creating dossiers of dismissed employees, disgruntled workers, and suspected pranksters. Sabotage or protest. Not all officials agreed on the motive. Some insisted it was simply theft and opportunistic crime dressed up as something larger. Others argued it was a form of labor protest. The early 1880s were rife with railroad strikes, and workers often clashed with management over wages, hours, and safety conditions. False lantern signals could have been a form of pressure, a demonstration of vulnerability meant to frighten the company into concessions. Third theory, whispered but rarely written down, was darker still: sabotage by competing railroads. The Pennsylvania Railroad was powerful, but it had rivals chief among them the Baltimore and Ohio and the New York Central. Could agents or sympathizers of a rival have staged the incident to sow distrust, to delay shipments, to tarnish reputations? The Pinkertons, who prided themselves on professionalism, dismissed this theory as far-fetched. But in the taverns and train yards, it was spoken aloud. The fear spreads. By summer 1883, lantern switcheroos were no longer confined to rumor. Several confirmed cases had been recorded across the Midwest and Northeast. Each incident seemed minor in itself: no major wrecks, no mass robberies, but the psychological toll was growing. Engineers began to question signals they would once have obeyed without hesitation. Conductors whispered about ghost lights appearing in the fog, vanishing when approached. Passengers, overhearing scraps of gossip, grew anxious. For the men who worked the rails, it was worse still. To distrust a signal was to invite chaos, but to trust blindly was to risk catastrophe. The very foundation of their system, trust in the light, was eroding. Pinkerton's setback. In September 1883, the Pinkertons believed they had their breakthrough. A small gang of men was arrested near Cleveland, accused of staging lantern diversions to rob freight cars of tobacco and alcohol. For a brief moment, railroad executives breathed easier. Perhaps the culprits were merely opportunistic thieves, now behind bars. But relief was short-lived. Within weeks of the arrests, another lantern diversion was reported, this time in New Jersey. The gang in Cleveland could not have been responsible. The crime was spreading faster than the detectives could contain it. Toward resolution. By the end of 1883, the Pennsylvania Railroad had begun experimenting with new measures. Station agents were ordered to use distinctive patterns of lantern motion patterns known only to company men. Engineers were instructed to proceed cautiously if a lantern signal seemed unfamiliar. Telegraph operators were given new authority to override signals if suspicions arose. But none of these measures were foolproof. Lanterns were still lanterns, fragile, flickering, and easy to mimic. And for every adjustment made, criminals seemed ready to exploit another weakness. The Pinkertons remained on the case, filing confidential reports month after month, chasing rumors, interviewing suspects, and piecing together fragments of evidence. Yet no mastermind was ever identified, no central conspiracy unearthed. Instead, the Lantern Switcheroo remained an elusive, shadowy threat, less a crime to be solved than a vulnerability to be endured. The unsettled question. And so, as 1883 drew to a close, the Pennsylvania Railroad found itself in a troubling position. It had poured money into detectives, modified its codes, and reassured passengers that all was well. Yet the fear remained, gnawing quietly at the edges of confidence. If a single lantern could undermine the order of the rails, what did that say about the safety of the entire system? Which raises the question, was the Lantern Switcheroo of 1883 truly the work of a handful of thieves and pranksters? Or was it a warning sign of something much larger, a shift in the balance between trust, technology, and human cunning that would haunt the railroads for decades to come? By the dawn of 1884, the Pennsylvania Railroad had endured a year of quiet disruption. No wrecks had occurred, no great robberies were recorded, and yet the Lantern Switcheroo lingered in the company's boardrooms like an unswept cobweb. It was the kind of crime that did not leave scars but stains, invisible, unsettling, and impossible to wash away completely. For most passengers, the matter passed unnoticed. The average traveler saw only the smooth operation of the line, the polished brass of locomotives, and the reassuring uniform of the conductor. But behind the scenes, the railroads were forced to reckon with the uncomfortable truth that their mighty enterprise could be manipulated by the simplest of tools. The slow decline of the lantern. Lanterns did not disappear overnight. They remained essential, particularly in yards and on sidings, for decades afterward. But the events of 1883 marked the beginning of a gradual shift. Where once lantern signals had been treated as gospel, unquestioned, and absolute, they now came to be regarded with a wary eye. The railroad began to emphasize the telegraph even more heavily, assigning dispatchers greater control over train movements. Orders were transmitted via coded messages, signed and acknowledged by station agents before being handed to engineers. It was not foolproof. Telegraph errors could be deadly in their own right, but it was less vulnerable to strangers with painted glass. By the 1890s, mechanical signals fixed arms by the side of the tracks, raised or lowered by levers in signal towers, were becoming standard. These semaphores could not be carried away, imitated, or swung by any passerby. They were, in essence, the death knell for lantern-based control of mainline traffic. Lanterns would survive in yards, as hand signals between brakemen and conductors, but their reign as arbiters of the rails was ending. Lingering theories. Despite the technological progress, the central mystery of the 1883 switcheroo was never solved. The thieves were never identified, the stolen parcels never recovered, and so speculation thrived. The disgruntled brakeman theory held strong among many railroad men. Caro, the dismissed brakeman, remained the favorite suspect, though no court ever proved his guilt. His habit of boasting, his access to equipment, and his resentment all aligned too neatly. Yet without evidence, his name faded into obscurity. The farmhand prank theory remained popular in Derry itself. Local farmers swore it had been young men with too much time, too much ale, and too little foresight. That theory explained the lack of profit and the crude, dyed lantern globe found in the hedgerow, but it did not explain the copycat incidents in other states. The conspiracy theory that rival railroads had orchestrated the disruptions was the most tantalizing, but also the least provable. The Pinkertons dismissed it as paranoia. Yet some historians note that railway competition in the 1880s was fierce, cutthroat even, and not always limited to boardroom maneuvering. In the end, the truth was swallowed by the darkness of time. The human cost of distrust. What endured most visibly was not the theft itself, but the shift in mentality among railroad men. Before 1883, signals were trusted absolutely. Afterward, engineers began to look twice, to hesitate, to question. That hesitation saved lives in some cases, but it also created tension. Trains stopped unnecessarily, schedules slipped, and the great dream of railroads as unstoppable machines of progress was tarnished. Trust is an invisible currency in systems that rely on human judgment. And in 1883, that currency was devalued. The lantern switcheroo had shown how fragile the rails really were, not the steel, but the trust that bound men together in their roles. A whisper in history. Today, few remember the lantern switcheroo. It is not taught alongside the great wrecks, nor memorialized like the infamous robberies of Jesse James or Butch Cassidy. It survives mostly in scattered newspaper clippings, a few Pinkerton files, and the oral traditions of old railway men who like to tell of ghost lanterns that lured trains astray. And yet, its impact can be traced in subtle ways. In the acceleration of mechanical signaling, in the growing power of telegraph dispatchers, and in the culture of caution that began to pervade railway operations. Quiet crimes often ripple farther than loud ones, their influence felt not in headlines but in habits. The lasting reflection. The lantern switcheroo of 1883 was, at its core, a story about vulnerability. It reminds us that systems built on trust, however vast or mighty, can be undone by the smallest deception. A painted lantern globe, a steady hand in the night, a simple gesture misinterpreted and the course of steel leviathans altered. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is this. If such a crime could go unsolved, if the culprits could vanish without a trace, how many other manipulations were quietly buried, never reported, never remembered? The railroads had every incentive to suppress such stories, to preserve confidence in their safety. What we know may only be a fraction of what truly occurred. So when you picture the great engines of the 19th century, thundering across the landscape under a canopy of stars, spare a thought for the frailty of their guidance. Not the steel, not the coal, not the engineers at the throttle, but the fragile glow of lanterns, and the shadows that learned how to bend that glow to their will. Story 2. The curious case of the Erie Canal toll fraud. On a crisp autumn morning in 1853, long before locomotives fully eclipsed waterways, the Erie Canal bustled with life. Flatboats and packet boats crept slowly along its waters, laden with barrels of flour, kegs of nails, and crates of apples bound for New York City. Farmers and merchants depended on this water highway, stretching 363 miles from Albany to Buffalo, to transform their goods into profit. The canal was the great democratizer of commerce. Slow, yes, but steady and affordable, connecting the Midwest to the Atlantic. And yet, for all its promise, the Erie Canal had a weakness: its toll system. Every lock, every way station, every passage through its narrow gates meant payment to the state. Revenue from these tolls funded maintenance, wages, and improvements. By the 1850s, the canal had become not just a marvel of engineering, but a vital source of state income. Millions of dollars flowed into New York's treasury from its toll houses. But where money flows, deception follows. The toll houses. To understand the fraud, we must picture a toll house. A small brick or wooden structure sat beside the canal, its windows facing the water. Inside, a collector kept ledgers and scales. Boats passing through were required to stop, declare their cargo, and often be weighed to determine the toll owed. The rates varied depending on the type of goods: flour, grain, timber, coal, manufactured items. The system relied on trust in the honesty of boatmen declaring their loads, and trust in the diligence of collectors recording them. Yet human nature being what it is, opportunities abounded. A dishonest collector could underreport the cargo, pocketing the difference. A boatman could collude, bribing an official to look the other way. Sometimes even the weigh scales themselves could be tampered with, their counterweights subtly altered. The fraud, when it was uncovered, revealed not just petty theft, but a sprawling network of deceit stretching across dozens of miles of waterway. The first whispers. The Erie Canal frauds came to light slowly, like a leak in a locked gate. In 1852, state auditors noticed discrepancies in toll revenues between neighboring stations. One toll house reported unusually light traffic, while another just a few miles away recorded heavy passage. The goods, however, were the same. Where had the missing revenue gone? Merchants began to whisper of favoritism. Some boatmen seemed to glide through tolls with suspicious ease, their fees lower than others carrying identical cargo. Rumors spread that collectors were accepting bribes, shaving off fees in exchange for coins slipped under the counter. The whispers reached Albany, where legislators, already suspicious of corruption in canal management, ordered an investigation. The auditors step in. When auditors arrived at the toll houses, they found the ledgers neat and orderly. Cargoes were listed, weights recorded, payments marked. But numbers can lie, especially when written by those with reason to deceive. The true test came when auditors compared records between stations. A boat that declared 100 barrels of flour in Utica might, by the time it reached Syracuse, be recorded with 150. Had the boat grown heavier on the water? Of course not. Someone was altering the records. Investigators also found evidence of tampered scales. At one toll house, the counterweights used to balance cargo were found to be hollowed out and filled with lead, causing them to register inaccurately. This simple trick allowed collectors to declare boats lighter than they truly were, reducing the tolls owed and leaving a tidy surplus for the conspirators. The human element. At the heart of the fraud was human behavior. Toll collectors were not wealthy men. Their wages were modest, their work repetitive. The canal was long, the boats many, and oversight minimal. It was easy, perhaps too easy, for a collector to shave off a little here, a little there. And once a bribe was accepted, once an entry was altered, the cycle became difficult to break. Boatmen, too, had their reasons. A dollar saved in tolls was a dollar gained in profit, and competition on the canal was fierce. Some were eager participants, willing to collude. Others were reluctant, pressed into bribery simply to keep up with rivals who were already enjoying reduced fees. In time, the fraud grew so common that it became almost normalized. "That's just how it works," one boatman was recorded as saying. "You pay the state something, and the man in the house something else." The extent of the loss. By 1853, estimates suggested that New York State was losing tens of thousands of dollars annually to toll fraud. In modern terms, it would amount to millions. Legislators, already wary of public outrage, sought to keep the scandal quiet even as they pursued investigations. The Erie Canal was not just an economic tool. It was a symbol of state pride, a monument to progress. Admitting it had been compromised was dangerous. Yet the evidence was too strong to ignore. Multiple toll houses were implicated, with collectors dismissed and, in some cases, prosecuted. But prosecutions proved difficult. Boatmen closed ranks, refusing to testify against collectors they had colluded with. Collectors claimed they were scapegoats, punished for what everyone was doing. The web of deceit seemed endless, reaching from the smallest village toll house all the way to the halls of Albany itself. The personal cost. Behind the numbers were real people, men who found themselves entangled in a system of dishonesty. Some collectors, confronted by investigators, broke down in tears, confessing they had been drawn into fraud by debt or desperation. Others denied everything, even as evidence piled high. For the honest men, the scandal was equally devastating. Those who had refused bribes found themselves tainted by association, their reputations tarnished simply by working in a system riddled with corruption. Trust evaporated, replaced by suspicion and resentment. And for the public, the revelation struck at something deeper than money. The Erie Canal was supposed to embody progress, fairness, and opportunity. To learn it was tainted by deceit was to feel betrayed by the very artery of commerce that had built towns and livelihoods. The unanswered question. As the investigation widened, one question loomed larger than any other. How far up did the fraud reach? Were these isolated toll collectors taking advantage of lax oversight? Or was there a deeper conspiracy, sanctioned if not orchestrated by higher officials who stood to gain from the flow of illicit money? The ledgers hinted at patterns too consistent to be random. Certain boatmen always received favorable treatment. Certain stations always reported suspiciously light weights. But proving intent, let alone conspiracy, required evidence no one seemed willing to provide. And so, as 1853 drew on, the auditors pressed forward, but the truth remained murky. Were they dealing with scattered dishonesty, or with a corruption that touched the very foundations of the canal administration? The toll houses of the Erie Canal were supposed to be symbols of order, neat ledgers, steady weights, predictable revenues flowing into the state treasury. But by the mid-1850s, the toll fraud scandal had begun to unravel that image. What began as whispers in taverns and rumors among merchants was transforming into a full-fledged political crisis. The state auditors who had been sent to inspect the canal found themselves in the middle of a storm they had not anticipated. They had expected to find carelessness, perhaps a few petty cheats. What they discovered instead was a system so riddled with corruption that it called into question the very legitimacy of New York's prized waterway. The paper trail. Ledgers, carefully maintained by toll collectors, were meant to serve as the official record of canal traffic. Every barrel of flour, every bale of hay, every ton of coal was to be logged. But auditors comparing records between stations quickly realized the numbers were not only inconsistent, they were deliberately falsified. Boats were declared lighter at one station, heavier at the next. Some cargo seemed to vanish entirely between locks, only to reappear later. In some cases, the handwriting in the ledgers revealed that entries had been altered after the fact, different ink, different strokes, numbers rubbed out and rewritten. When auditors attempted to reconcile the records with merchants' own invoices, the discrepancies became undeniable. Goods worth thousands of dollars were slipping through the cracks, their tolls unpaid. And yet, almost no one was willing to admit guilt. The wall of silence. When collectors were confronted, most professed ignorance. They insisted their scales were accurate, their ledgers honest. Boatmen, when questioned, denied ever paying bribes. It was only in private conversations, whispered over ale, that the truth crept out. Some collectors confessed quietly that they had been pressured. "If I did not play along," one man admitted, "I'd be out of a position within the month." Others hinted that the fraud was not merely tolerated but expected. There were rumors that supervisors looked the other way, or even encouraged the deception, as long as a portion of the skimmed money flowed upward. For auditors, this wall of silence was the greatest obstacle. They could prove discrepancies, but they could not easily prove intent or trace the missing revenue to specific pockets. Political entanglements. The deeper the investigation went, the more it became clear that canal fraud was not confined to lonely toll houses. Politics in Albany was never far from the canal. The Erie had been built with state funds, championed by governors, and celebrated by legislators as the engine of prosperity. With so much money at stake, political machines soon wrapped their fingers around its operations. Appointments to toll houses were often political favors. A collector might owe his position not to his diligence, but to the patronage of a local assemblyman. In return, he was expected to pass along a share of his earnings. The auditor's reports began to hint cautiously at this wider network. Collectors were not simply corrupt in isolation. They were tied to county officials, who in turn were tied to party bosses in Albany. To expose one was to risk exposing many. The public awakens. By 1854, the scandal could no longer be contained within state offices. Leaks to the press began appearing, and newspapers eagerly seized on the story. The Albany Evening Journal declared that millions belonging to the people have been diverted by a conspiracy of fraud along the canal. Public anger surged. Farmers and merchants, who had long suspected they were being cheated, demanded accountability. "Why should honest boatmen pay full toll?" one editorial asked, "while rogues glide free under the cloak of collusion?" The press painted vivid images of collectors growing fat while the state treasury starved, of political bosses enriching themselves on the backs of ordinary citizens. For legislators, the scandal was no longer just an embarrassment, it was a threat to their very careers. Investigative tactics. In response, the state authorized deeper investigations. Auditors began making unannounced visits to toll houses, bringing with them new scales and weights to test for tampering. They began shadowing boats along the canal, comparing the cargoes declared at each station. Pinkerton detectives, by then already famed for their work with railroads, were quietly consulted to advise on methods of detection. Some auditors went further still, using deception of their own. They posed as merchants, sending shipments through the canal to test how their cargoes were recorded. In many cases, they found exactly what they suspected: weights understated, tolls underpaid, collectors pocketing the difference. Still, the higher connections remained elusive. Boatmen and collectors might be caught, but they refused to implicate their political patrons. Fear, loyalty, or perhaps simple pragmatism kept them silent. The dismissals begin. By 1855, the scandal reached its first breaking point. Several collectors were dismissed from their posts, their names published in newspapers as examples of corruption. A handful were prosecuted, though few served significant sentences. For the public, it was a small measure of satisfaction, but for investigators, it was far from enough. Because the pattern continued. For every collector dismissed, another took his place and often fell into the same habits. The system itself, built on trust and patronage, seemed to invite dishonesty. The deeper question. By now, the toll fraud scandal was no longer simply about money. It had become a test of faith in public institutions. Could the state of New York govern its own Great Canal honestly? Or was corruption so deeply woven into the fabric of politics and commerce that it could not be rooted out? One legislator, in a rare moment of candor, admitted as much. "We may dismiss every collector from Albany to Buffalo, and still the fraud will return. It is not the men but the system that is broken." It was a chilling realization. If true, the fraud was not an aberration, it was a symptom. Toward a reckoning. As public outrage mounted, calls for reform grew louder. Some demanded stricter oversight, others suggested abolishing the toll system altogether. Radical voices even whispered that the canal should be privatized, taken out of the hands of the state entirely. But reform would not come easily. Too many pockets were being lined, too many interests entangled. Any attempt to change the system risked alienating powerful figures in Albany. And so, as the winter of 1855 approached, the investigation stood at a crossroads. Auditors had evidence of fraud, the press had stirred public anger, and a handful of men had been sacrificed to appease outrage. Yet the heart of the conspiracy, the political machinery that enabled it, remained untouched. Which left the public to wonder, would justice ever reach beyond the toll house windows, up into the halls of power themselves? Or would the Erie Canal toll fraud fade into history as just another scandal, briefly illuminated and then buried in silence? By the time the toll fraud scandal reached its height in the late 1850s, the Erie Canal was no longer simply a marvel of engineering. It had become a stage for political battles, moral reckonings, and public outrage. The fraud had revealed something more corrosive than theft. It had shown how deeply dishonesty could burrow into a system that was meant to embody fairness and progress. For decades, the canal had been the pride of New York. Farmers in the Midwest and merchants in Manhattan had alike hailed it as the artery of prosperity. But now, under the glare of investigation and newspaper ink, it stood tarnished. The trials and the theater. Some prosecutions followed, though most played out more like theater than justice. Collectors were paraded before courts, accused of falsifying ledgers and tampering with scales. A few were convicted, their sentences light, small fines, brief imprisonment. Others were acquitted for lack of evidence, their guilt whispered but never proven. The public, expecting sweeping reform, grew restless. "One man falls, another rises," wrote the New York Tribune, "and the system endures unchanged." Indeed, it seemed that for every dishonest collector dismissed, another equally corrupt took his place. Boatmen learned quickly which new tollkeepers could be approached with bribes, which ones could be pressured, and which were best avoided. The cycle continued. Political maneuvering. In Albany, legislators faced a dilemma. On one hand, they could not ignore the scandal voters demanded action. On the other, too many of them owed their own power to the same networks of patronage that fueled the corruption. Appointments to toll houses were still political currency, traded for loyalty and campaign support. So politicians turned to half measures. Special commissions were created, promising to root out fraud. Regulations were tightened, scales inspected, supervisors instructed to keep closer watch. And yet, the deeper structural problem, the intertwining of politics and canal management, remained untouched. Behind closed doors, some legislators quietly admitted that rooting out corruption entirely would be impossible. The fraud was not a weed to be pulled, but soil in which the entire system grew. Public reforms. Still, some reforms did take hold. By the early 1860s, new scales were introduced, designed to be less easily tampered with. Toll collectors were required to post bonds, financial guarantees meant to discourage dishonesty. Audits became more frequent, and surprise inspections more common. These measures reduced but did not eliminate fraud. Bribes and collusion continued, though often more carefully concealed. Meanwhile, public pressure led to broader debates about the future of the canal itself. Should tolls be abolished altogether? Some argued that the canal had paid for itself many times over, and that free passage would stimulate trade without the burden of corruption. Others insisted the tolls were vital revenue for the state, too important to discard. The turning point. The true turning point came not from reform alone, but from competition. By the 1860s and 1870s, railroads were rapidly expanding, offering faster and more flexible transport than canal boats. Merchants increasingly turned to trains, leaving the Erie Canal less central to commerce than it once had been. With declining traffic came declining revenues. The elaborate schemes of toll fraud became less profitable, and with less at stake, the scale of corruption gradually shrank. By the 1880s, the canal remained important but no longer dominated New York's economy as it once had. The scandal faded, not because it was resolved, but because history moved on. The human legacy. For the men caught up in the scandal, the toll fraud was not just a political issue but a personal one. Some collectors lost everything: their positions, their reputations, their standing in their communities. Others escaped unscathed, their guilt suspected but never proven. Boatmen who had once colluded found themselves under greater scrutiny, forced to pay full tolls again, their margins squeezed. And honest men, who had endured suspicion simply for working along the canal, carried the bitterness of being tarnished by a scandal they had resisted. Lessons written in water. In hindsight, the Erie Canal toll fraud was not unique. Wherever money flowed through human hands, temptation followed. What made this case remarkable was its scale, and the way it revealed the fragility of systems built on trust and patronage. The Erie Canal was supposed to embody fairness, a level playing field for commerce, an equalizer for farmers and merchants. Instead, It mirrored the flaws of the society that built it. It showed how greed could seep quietly into institutions, how corruption could become normalized, how entire systems could be bent to serve private ends while maintaining a facade of legitimacy. The reflection. Today, the Erie Canal is remembered as a triumph of engineering, a symbol of America's ambition in the early 19th century. Its fraud scandal is less often told, buried in state archives and yellowing newspapers. Yet the lessons endure. The scandal teaches that corruption need not be spectacular to be corrosive. It rarely arrives with gunfire or robbery. More often, it arrives quietly, in the form of small compromises, routine dishonesty, and systems too weak to resist. It teaches that trust, once eroded, is not easily rebuilt. And it reminds us that progress and corruption often travel side by side, each shaping the other in ways both seen and unseen. So when we imagine the canal boats gliding slowly past fields and towns, their cargo bound for distant markets, we might also picture the toll house's small, unremarkable buildings where trust was weighed alongside goods, and too often found wanting. Story 3. The mysterious milk wagon poisonings in Manchester. On the damp, fog-draped mornings of 1870s Manchester, the day often began not with the factory whistle, but with the creak of wooden wheels over cobblestones. The milk wagons came first. They clattered through narrow streets lined with brick terraces, their horses steaming in the chill air, their drivers calling out as they ladled milk into the waiting jugs of housewives and children. For a penny or two, a family could secure their morning measure thin, sometimes watered down, but essential for tea, porridge, and bread. Milk was the daily sustenance of the city's working class. In homes where meat was a luxury and vegetables often scarce, milk was the reliable constant. It nourished infants, softened the coarseness of bread, and provided strength to men worn down by the endless grind of cotton mills. But in the 1870s, that seemingly simple gift of sustenance became the source of fear, illness, and whispered accusations when a string of unexplained poisonings struck households across Manchester. The first cases. The first reports came from Ancoats, one of the city's most densely packed industrial districts. In June 1871, 3 children in a single household fell violently ill within hours of drinking their morning milk. Their symptoms were sudden and frightening: stomach pains, vomiting, and convulsions. One child died before a physician could arrive. At first, the cause seemed unclear. The doctor, accustomed to the ailments of poverty, cholera, typhoid, food spoilage, suspected bad meat or contaminated water. But when a similar illness struck another household nearby, also after the morning milk, suspicion began to narrow. By July, cases had spread. Families who bought from the same milk wagon reported illness. In some, children died. In others, adults were stricken, though less severely. The common thread was milk ladled from the same wagon, delivered by a local dairyman named Thomas Ward. Milk in the city. To understand the significance, one must appreciate the role of milk in Manchester's urban life. The city's dairies were not pastoral farms but cramped stables tucked into alleys, where cows were often kept in filthy conditions, fed on brewery waste or vegetable scraps. Milk was hauled directly from these urban cows to wagons, sometimes diluted with water to stretch supply, sometimes adulterated with chalk or flour to disguise poor quality. Regulation was minimal. Until the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act of 1860, there was no legal standard for purity. Even after the law, enforcement was patchy. Milk drinkers relied on trust the word of the dairyman who ladled into their jug. And when that trust faltered, as it did in 1871, panic spread quickly. A community alarmed. As word of the poisoning circulated, fear took hold in working-class districts. Mothers refused milk, turning instead to tea or gruel for their children. Rumors multiplied. Some whispered that arsenic had been added deliberately, others that rats had contaminated the milk pails. A few even claimed that rival dairymen had poisoned Ward's supply to drive him out of business. The local press seized on the story. The Manchester Guardian reported cautiously at first, noting only suspicions of adulteration. But smaller broadsheets were less restrained, running headlines about milk murders in Ancoats. For the city's poor, who relied heavily on milk as one of their few nutritious staples, the fear was palpable. To distrust milk was to distrust survival. The investigation begins. Authorities, under pressure from public outrage, began an inquiry. Samples of milk from Ward's wagon were tested by local chemists. To the shock of investigators, several samples contained traces of arsenic, a deadly poison that even in small doses could kill a child. How had it entered the milk? Ward swore innocence. He claimed his milk came directly from his cows, that he had watered it down but never added anything more. He suggested sabotage, that someone had tampered with his pails while his wagon was left unattended in the yard. The chemists pressed further. Arsenic was commonly found in dyes, wallpapers, and rat poison, all readily available in Manchester's shops. Could the milk have been contaminated accidentally, or was it deliberate? A city on edge. The possibility of deliberate poisoning transformed the scandal into something darker. It was one thing for milk to be watered down or mixed with chalk dishonest, but not usually fatal. It was quite another for it to contain a substance long associated with murder. Police began questioning Ward's rivals. Milkmen competed fiercely for customers, often undercutting one another's prices or spreading rumors about poor quality. Was it possible a competitor had slipped poison into Ward's supply, hoping to ruin his business? Ward himself became the target of suspicion. Neighbors muttered about his temper, about debts owed, about quarrels in taverns. Though he protested his innocence, the stigma of being linked to poisoned milk clung to him like soot. The wider implications. What made the case so unsettling was not just the deaths, but what they revealed about urban life in the industrial age. If milk could not be trusted, what else was unsafe? Bread, meat, water, all had already been suspect in a city plagued by adulteration. The milk poisonings were not just a tragedy, they were a symbol of the precariousness of working-class survival. The scandal also highlighted the limits of law. The Adulteration Act was supposed to protect the public, but without effective enforcement, it was little more than words on paper. Inspectors were too few, penalties too light, and the temptation for profit too strong. An unresolved fear. By autumn, the poisonings had slowed, though whether from tighter scrutiny or sheer chance remained unclear. Ward eventually left the milk trade, his reputation too damaged to continue. No one was ever charged with murder. The coroner's inquests offered little comfort, concluding only that poisonous matter was present by means unknown. And yet the question lingered, whispered in kitchens and street markets long after. Was Thomas Ward an unlucky victim of sabotage, or a careless or even malicious perpetrator? Was the arsenic in Manchester's milk the result of rivalry, accident, or something far more sinister? The milk poisonings of 1871 had left Manchester shaken. In the tight-knit streets of Ancoats and Holme, where families lived cheek by jowl in soot-darkened terraces, conversations returned again and again to the same refrain: who could have poisoned the milk? Though the coroner's inquests offered little satisfaction, the story refused to fade. Physicians, reformers, and journalists all seized upon it as proof of a larger crisis, the danger of adulterated food in Britain's rapidly growing industrial cities. The voice of reform. Among the most vocal critics was Dr. John Thomas, a Manchester physician who had long campaigned against adulteration. He had seen too many children brought low by tainted food, flour mixed with plaster of Paris, sweets colored with lead, vinegar stretched with sulfuric acid. To him, the milk poisonings were not an isolated crime, but part of a broader pattern. In a lecture given at the Mechanics Institute later that year, Thomas declared, "When the very milk we place upon our children's lips becomes a vessel for poison, whether by fraud or folly, then society itself has failed in its most basic duty, to protect the innocent." His words struck a chord. The Manchester Examiner reprinted them in full, and other reformers took up the cause. They pressed Parliament to strengthen the Adulteration of Food and Drink Act, to empower inspectors with greater authority, and to impose harsher penalties on those who endangered public health. The competing dairymen. While reformers pressed their case, suspicion continued to swirl around Manchester's dairymen. Milk was a competitive trade, its profits narrow, its rivalries fierce. In neighborhoods where loyalty to a milk wagon was built over years of daily service, any scandal could shift customers overnight. Police quietly interviewed several of Ward's competitors. One, a dairyman named Samuel Fletcher, was rumored to have mocked Ward's misfortune, telling patrons that better to buy milk without corpses in it. Another rival, whose route overlapped with Ward, was found to have gained many of Ward's former customers after the scandal broke. Yet no evidence tied them directly to the poisonings. No arsenic was discovered in their wagons. No witnesses testified to sabotage. The rivalries explained motive, perhaps, but not means. Accidental contamination. Not all investigators were convinced of foul play. Some suggested that the arsenic might have entered the milk accidentally. In Manchester, arsenic was everywhere. In the green dyes used for wallpaper and textiles, in rat poison kept in households, even in the byproducts of chemical works that dotted the industrial landscape. One theory held that Ward's milk cans, cleaned hastily in water drawn from a canal polluted by chemical effluent, might have picked up trace arsenic. Another posited that the cows themselves, fed on brewers' grains and factory waste, might have ingested contaminated fodder. Chemists debated these possibilities in public meetings, their arguments reported eagerly by the press. Some scoffed at the idea of accidental contamination, pointing out that the concentrations detected in the milk were too high. Others insisted it was entirely plausible in a city where industry and daily life mixed so dangerously. The lack of certainty only deepened public unease. The strain on households. For the working poor, the scandal had immediate consequences. Milk sales dropped sharply in the months following the poisonings. Families turned to substitutes tea, often purchased cheap and of dubious quality, condensed milk, imported in tins, or simply more bread and gruel. Infants suffered most. Breastfeeding was not always possible for working mothers forced into mills or laundries, and cow's milk was often the only alternative. Infant mortality, already high in Manchester, rose sharply in neighborhoods where families shunned fresh milk. The scandal thus became more than a matter of crime or fraud. It was a public health crisis that rippled through daily life, striking hardest at the most vulnerable. The law in motion. Under pressure from reformers and the press, local magistrates began testing milk more frequently. Ward himself was fined under the Adulteration Act, not for poisoning, but for selling watered-down milk, an irony that only deepened suspicions against him. But broader prosecutions faltered. The law was not designed to handle deliberate poisoning, only adulteration. The line between carelessness and criminal intent proved slippery. Ward's defenders insisted he was guilty only of the common practices of his trade, watering milk, stretching profits, but not of murder. The case highlighted a gap in the law, how to treat acts that straddled the line between fraud and homicide. Parliament debated amendments, but progress was slow. The press as judge. As often happens in cases of uncertainty, the press became the jury. Some papers condemned Ward outright, branding him the milk murderer of Ancoats. Others took a more cautious line, suggesting he had been framed by rivals. Cartoons appeared in satirical magazines showing skeletons ladling milk from wagons, or grim-faced cows drinking from barrels marked with skull and crossbones. Public trust in milkmen, already fragile, eroded further. Ward eventually left Manchester entirely, relocating to Liverpool in hopes of starting anew. But the stain of suspicion followed him, whispered wherever his name arose. A pattern beyond Manchester. By 1872, cases of suspicious milk poisonings were reported in other cities: Birmingham, Leeds, even parts of London. Not all involved arsenic. Some were cases of milk tainted with sewage or chemicals. But each echoed the same theme. Urbanization had made food both more necessary and more dangerous. The milk wagon poisonings in Manchester were simply the most notorious early example, a symbol of the risks that came when trust, profit, and public health collided. The unresolved question. By the end of 1872, no culprit had been convicted, no clear explanation had triumphed. The milk poisonings faded from headlines, replaced by new scandals, new tragedies. But for those who lived through them, the memory lingered, a reminder that even the most ordinary act, pouring milk into a child's cup, could conceal danger. And so the question endured. Was Manchester's milk poisoned by malice, by accident, or by a system so corrupted by neglect that the difference no longer mattered? By the mid-1870s, the city of Manchester had grown used to living with scandal. Its factories belched smoke, its streets groaned under overcrowding, and its newspapers overflowed with stories of strikes, accidents, and outbreaks of disease. Yet for many families, the milk wagon poisonings of 1871 lingered in memory long after the headlines had faded. Milk had been more than nourishment. It had been a rare comfort, a link between the industrial city and the imagined safety of the countryside. To discover it tainted whether by fraud, negligence, or deliberate poison was to confront the fragility of everyday survival in a world where trust was already stretched thin. Reform through fear. The scandal became a rallying cry for reformers. Public health activists, physicians, and moralists used the memory of poisoned milk to push for stronger laws. Their efforts contributed to the passage of the Sale of Food and Drugs Act of 1875, which strengthened inspection powers, standardized penalties, and broadened the definition of adulteration. Under the new act, local authorities could appoint analysts to test food samples, and vendors found guilty of adulteration faced fines or imprisonment. For the first time, there was a legal framework robust enough to address not just diluted milk, but potentially deadly contamination. It was, in part, the shadow of Manchester's poisonings that gave urgency to the law. Fear, more than principle, had moved Parliament to act. Changing practices. In the years that followed, the milk trade began to change. Urban dairies, with cows crowded into stables behind taverns or workshops, faced increasing scrutiny. Reformers pushed for milk to come instead from rural farms, where conditions were seen rightly or wrongly as more wholesome. Railways, expanding across Britain, made it easier to transport fresh milk from the countryside into cities. By the 1880s, trains laden with churns of milk became a common sight, reshaping the very geography of food supply. The daily milk wagon still rattled down Manchester streets, but now its cargo often began far from the city's polluted air. At the same time, consumers became more cautious. Middle-class families began boiling their milk as a precaution, a practice that slowly spread among the working class as well. What had once been taken on trust was now treated with suspicion. The human aftermath. For Thomas Ward, the dairyman at the center of the storm, the consequences were permanent. Though never convicted of murder, his reputation never recovered. In Liverpool, where he tried to begin again, whispers followed. Rivals exploited the rumor, customers avoided his wagon, and eventually he left the trade altogether. His fate, beyond that, slips into obscurity, one of many ordinary men crushed by scandal, whether guilty or not. For the families who lost children, there was no resolution. Inquests had delivered only vague verdicts: death by poison, source unknown. The absence of accountability compounded the grief, leaving wounds that never fully healed. The broader lesson: the milk wagon poisonings forced Manchester, and Britain more broadly, to confront the risks of industrial life in a new way. It was not just cholera in the water or smog in the air, but corruption in the very food supply. The case showed how easily necessity could be weaponized, how fragile trust was in systems built on unregulated commerce. Food fraud was nothing new, but milk touched a deeper nerve. It was associated with children, with purity, with daily comfort. To find poison, there was to feel that no corner of life was safe from exploitation or neglect. Memory and forgetting. By the end of the century, the milk wagon poisonings had largely faded from public memory, overshadowed by larger scandals and by the steady march of reform. The Sale of Food and Drugs Acts of 1875, 1879, and 1899 gradually built a framework for modern food safety. Public analysts became fixtures in local government, and prosecutions for adulteration grew common. Yet among old-timers in Manchester, the story lingered. In taverns and kitchens, people spoke of the days when milk could kill, when mothers poured out their jugs in fear, when children died after their morning tea. The story became half folklore, half cautionary tale, told with a shudder but rarely with details. Reflection: trust in the ordinary. The mysterious milk wagon poisonings were never fully solved. Perhaps they were the work of a careless dairyman whose kids picked up arsenic from contaminated cleaning water. Perhaps they were sabotaged by a rival, ruthless enough to risk murder for customers. Or perhaps they were a tragic accident, amplified by rumor and fear. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same. Trust in an ordinary necessity was shattered, and in that shattering lay the real crime. For it is one thing when danger comes from outlaws, from gunmen, from figures we already imagine as threats. It is another when danger hides in the routine of daily life, in the ladle of milk poured into a child's cup, in the comfort of a morning ritual. The milk poisonings remind us that crime need not be loud to be devastating. Sometimes it is quiet, seeping into the smallest corners of existence, altering habits, reshaping laws, and leaving shadows that linger long after the facts are forgotten. Story 4. The Telegraph Wire Cutters of Dakota Territory. In the 1870s, when the Dakota Territory was still a patchwork of homesteads, military outposts, and scattered settlements, the most important lifeline was not the wagon trail or even the railway, it was the telegraph. A single thin wire, strung between poles that marched endlessly across the plains, carried news, orders, and lifeblood communication between east and west. The telegraph was more than technology, it was authority. Messages from Washington could reach forts in hours instead of weeks. Merchants could confirm shipments, railroads could schedule trains, newspapers could print war updates almost in real time. For settlers scattered across the frontier, the faint tapping of the telegraph key in the local office was the sound of belonging to a nation. But in Dakota Territory, that fragile line of communication came under attack. In 1876, as tensions between settlers, the U.S. military, and native tribes simmered, telegraph wires began to fall, cut cleanly, deliberately, sometimes miles at a time. And with each silent line, the tenuous hold of order on the plains grew weaker. The first incident. The earliest reports came from near Yankton, the territorial capital. In March 1876, telegraph operators discovered a stretch of line disabled, the wire lying coiled in the grass. At first, they suspected a storm wind often snapped poles, ice weighed down lines. But the wire had been cut clean through and the poles stood untouched. Soon, more cases followed. Lines north of Vermilion, west near the Missouri River, even stretches used by the military to coordinate with outposts farther inland were found cut. Repair crews worked feverishly, restringing wires under the wide sky, only to find them severed again days later. The pattern was unmistakable. Someone or several someones was attacking the telegraph. Motives on the frontier. But why? What purpose did it serve to cut a wire? To understand, we must consider the role of the telegraph in the contested lands of Dakota. For the U.S. Army, it was a weapon as much as a tool. Orders to move troops, reports of skirmishes, requests for reinforcements all relied on telegraphy. For native tribes resisting encroachment, the wire was an extension of the enemy, a symbol of control and intrusion. Cutting it was a form of resistance, as well as a practical measure to delay military responses. Yet suspicion did not fall only on tribes. Settlers, too, had grievances. Some believed telegraph companies overcharged for messages, lining their pockets at the expense of struggling farmers. Others saw the telegraph as bound too closely with railroads and banks, institutions viewed with mistrust. And then there were more personal motives: disgruntled employees, vandals, or thieves hopping to sell copper wire for scrap. On the Dakota plains, where law was thin and grudges many, the motives seemed endless. The military response. The timing of the wire cuttings was especially alarming because 1876 was already a year of tension. That summer, conflict with the Lakota Sioux and Cheyenne tribes erupted in what became known as the Great Sioux War. Telegraph lines were essential for coordinating troop movements across vast distances. When wires went silent, forts found themselves isolated, unable to communicate with headquarters. In June of that year, messages concerning troop movements near the Little Bighorn were delayed by severed wires. Some later argued that the confusion contributed to the disastrous defeat of General George Custer and his men. While no direct proof linked wire cutting to that event, the fear of sabotage gnawed at military officers. To combat the problem, the Army began assigning small patrols to ride along telegraph routes, scanning for cut lines, repairing breaks, and watching for saboteurs. Yet the plains were vast, the wires long, and the cutters elusive. The telegraph men. The men most directly affected were the linemen, those tasked with maintaining the wires. They were hardy, practical men, accustomed to working alone for long stretches, carrying coils of wire and climbing spikes for repairs. In memoirs and letters, some described the eerie feeling of following a wire across the empty prairie, scanning for the spot where it had gone slack. One lineman, William Keating, recalled in his journal, "It is a strange thing to walk with one's eyes fixed on a line of iron stretched into the horizon, knowing that somewhere ahead, unseen hands have broken it. It is as if one follows a trail left by ghosts." For linemen, wire cutting was more than nuisance, it was a personal challenge, a duel against unseen saboteurs. Each repair felt like a victory, each fresh cut like a taunt. Suspicions and accusations. As the incidents multiplied, suspicion hardened. Military officers accused native tribes of sabotage, citing instances where cut wire was found near villages or trails. Settlers pointed fingers at rival settlers, accusing one another of malice or theft. Telegraph company officials insisted the attacks were deliberate and organized, warning of a conspiracy to destabilize the territory. But evidence was scarce. Few cutters were ever caught in the act. Lines ran for hundreds of miles across lonely country, and a man with wire cutters could strike quickly and vanish. When native men were arrested, they often denied involvement, sometimes pointing out that they had no use for wire and no tools to cut it cleanly. Others admitted proudly to tearing down poles and wires, declaring it an act of resistance against invasion. Yet even these confessions failed to explain every incident. Too many cuttings occurred far from contested lands, in places more likely to harbor disgruntled settlers than warriors. The unsettling effect. Whatever the cause, the effect was the same: silence. A cut wire could mean hours or days without communication, leaving forts and towns in uneasy isolation. Merchants could not confirm shipments, newspapers could not print the latest reports, families could not send word eastward. In a land already defined by distance and uncertainty, the sudden silence of the telegraph was more than inconvenience. It was a reminder of fragility that civilization's thread across the prairie was as thin as the wire itself, and just as easily broken. Toward a mystery. By autumn of 1876, wire cutting had become a persistent feature of life in Dakota. Patrols continued, repairs were made, accusations flew, but the culprits remained elusive. Some incidents were clearly acts of sabotage tied to conflict, others the work of vandals or thieves, and still others inexplicable. The mystery deepened with reports of entire coils of wire disappearing, miles of it, carefully taken down, as if harvested for some unseen purpose. Telegraph companies denied that such theft could be for profit. Scrap dealers would not buy such conspicuous quantities. Was the wire being repurposed for fences, or was something else at play? And so, by the close of 1876, the telegraph lines of Dakota stood as both symbols of progress and targets of defiance. Each fresh cutting raised the same unsettling question. Were these random acts of mischief and resistance, or was there a larger, coordinated effort to silence the voice of authority across the plains? By the winter of 1876, the wire-cutting crisis in Dakota Territory was no longer seen as an inconvenience, it was a menace. What had begun as scattered incidents now appeared with unnerving regularity. Each fresh break forced linemen into the cold to restring the thin iron threads, while officers at forts muttered about conspiracies and sabotage. The U.S. Army, stretched thin by the Great Sioux War, could ill afford the loss of its most vital line of communication. The war had already seen humiliations, none more searing than the disaster at the Little Bighorn that summer. Now, with telegraph lines falling silent, officers feared a second front, not just battles in the field, but a war on information itself. The watch on the wires. In late 1876, General Alfred Terry ordered military patrols to guard key stretches of wire. Cavalry units rode along the poles in pairs, watching for signs of tampering. Infantry detachments camped at vulnerable river crossings and wooded areas where saboteurs might hide. The duty was thankless. Soldiers trudged mile after mile along endless wire, the cold cutting through their coats, the wind hissing over the prairie. For days they saw nothing. Then, without warning, a wire would be found cut. The culprits vanished into the horizon. One sergeant later wrote bitterly in his diary, "We guard the line like a hen guards a string, and yet the fox comes in the night, and the line lies coiled in the grass by morning." Arrests and confessions. Eventually, the patrols bore fruit. In November, near the James River, a group of Lakota men was captured close to a severed section of wire. They were brought into Yankton under heavy guard, accused of sabotage. Under questioning, two admitted to cutting the line, claiming it was an act of resistance. "That wire carries the words of the soldier," one said, "so we cut it that his words will not come." The confessions seemed to confirm military suspicions, but they did not settle the matter. Telegraph cuttings continued in areas far removed from Lakota movements, even near settler towns where native presence was scarce. Some officers began to suspect that the problem was broader than resistance alone. Settler involvement. The settlers of Dakota Territory were themselves divided over the telegraph. To many, it was a blessing, a way to order supplies, send word to family, or read Eastern newspapers within days. But others saw it as an arm of distant power, an instrument of the federal government, the railroads, and the banks. Rumors circulated of settlers cutting wires to express resentment, or to strike against telegraph companies they felt were gouging them with high fees. A few even confessed privately to tampering with the wires, not for sabotage but for utility. Strands of telegraph wire made excellent fencing, strong and plentiful, and on the open plains, a few stolen miles could enclose valuable pasture. Telegraph company officials bristled at these claims, pointing out that wire was too heavy and cumbersome to steal in large quantities without notice. Yet reports of missing coils persisted, suggesting that some cuttings were motivated by theft as much as defiance. A whisper of conspiracy. By early 1877, whispers began to spread of a more organized effort. Telegraph officials reported cuttings across hundreds of miles, sometimes occurring simultaneously in distant locations. Could vandals or disgruntled settlers really coordinate such actions? Or was there a larger design at work? Some pointed to outlaw gangs, suggesting they cut wires to delay the transmission of news about robberies or raids. Others, more conspiratorial, claimed rival business interests wanted to undermine the telegraph to give their own routes or systems an advantage. The Army took the possibility seriously. In confidential reports, officers speculated that certain cuttings might have been timed deliberately to delay military dispatches, giving hostile forces more freedom of movement. While no proof emerged, the suspicion deepened the sense of unease. The human cost. For the linemen, the crisis was both a burden and a danger. Riding alone along the line, they became targets not just for saboteurs, but for suspicion. If a line went down too often in one area, locals sometimes accused the lineman himself of negligence or complicity. One lineman, Henry Lawson, was nearly lynched by angry settlers who believed he had cut the line to drum up more work for himself. He was saved only when a cavalry patrol intervened. The episode underscored how mistrust poisoned even the simplest relationships. Trials in Yankton. Several men, both native and settler, were eventually brought to trial in Yankton for telegraph sabotage. The proceedings attracted large crowds, curious to see justice applied to such an unusual crime. Yet convictions proved difficult. For every confession there were denials, for every accusation conflicting alibis. Some cases collapsed for lack of evidence, others resulted in minor penalties. Only a handful of men ever served time, and even then the sentences were light. Cutting a wire was a serious nuisance, but without clear proof of broader conspiracy, it was difficult to treat it as treason or war. Silence as a weapon. Despite the trials, the cuttings continued sporadically. Each fresh incident reinforced a troubling truth. Silence itself could be a weapon. On the frontier, where news traveled no faster than the telegraph, severing a wire could plunge forts and towns into isolation. The effect was psychological as much as practical. Officers hesitated to rely on messages, merchants fretted over delays, settlers feared that the line might go dark just when they needed it most. A thin thread of trust held the territory together, and each break frayed it further. The unanswered puzzle. By the end of 1877, the situation had improved slightly. Patrols and prosecutions had deterred some cutters, and new stretches of line were better guarded. But the mystery remained unresolved. Were the wire cuttings primarily the work of native resistance, as the Army claimed? Or were settlers, thieves, and opportunists equally responsible? And what of the unexplained simultaneous cuttings? Were they coincidence, or the shadow of something larger, a coordinated effort that history has yet to uncover? The telegraph, so mighty in its promise, had revealed its fragility. And in that fragility lay the unsettling question: how much of civilization on the frontier depended not on force of arms or flow of goods, but on a single wire stretched across empty land, vulnerable to the simplest of tools? By the spring of 1878, the crisis of the cut wires in Dakota Territory had subsided enough for officials in Yankton and Washington to breathe more easily. The lines were not fully safe. Occasional cuttings still plagued the network, but the frenzy of sabotage that had defined the preceding years was easing into memory. The Army, though never satisfied, gradually scaled back its wire patrols. The linemen still cursed their lonely rides, but the constant fear of nightly sabotage diminished. Townsfolk stopped turning every missing word into a whisper of conspiracy. And yet, though the drama receded, the consequences of the wire-cutting era endured long after the wires themselves had been mended. Military reforms. The Army drew several lessons from the ordeal. Chief among them was the recognition of the telegraph as a vulnerable artery of command. During the Sioux campaigns, commanders had discovered that a single act of sabotage could paralyze communication for days. In war, such silence could be fatal. In response, military planners adopted new measures. Some forts began using duplicate lines, strung along alternate routes, to provide backup in case of sabotage. Dispatch riders, once nearly obsolete, were reinstated as a parallel system to carry urgent news. It was an imperfect solution, slow and costly, but better than trusting the wire alone. The Army also developed stricter codes for its telegraph messages. If a line were cut and later spliced, saboteurs might attempt to listen in or intercept information. To counter this, officers began using basic ciphers, an early experiment in secure communication that foreshadowed later military cryptography. Legal precedents. The trials of those accused of wire cutting set unusual legal precedents in territorial courts. For the first time, judges had to decide whether severing a telegraph line was mere vandalism or a form of sabotage equivalent to destroying a public road or tampering with the mail. Most courts settled on the latter view. Cutting a wire, they ruled, was not simply property damage, but an attack on the flow of information vital to governance and commerce. These rulings established a principle that would echo into the modern era. Interference with communication lines was to be treated as a serious crime, no matter how invisible or intangible the medium seemed. The fate of the accused. Of the men who had confessed or been convicted, only a few served substantial time. The Lakota men captured near the James River spent months in custody, but were eventually released in a prisoner exchange tied to ongoing negotiations. Their act had been real, but the Army judged that punishing them further would serve little purpose in a war already rife with grievances. The settlers who faced trial fared differently. Some were fined for theft of wire, others jailed briefly for vandalism. One man, accused of repeatedly cutting wire to spite the telegraph company, spent nearly 2 years in prison before being released. He emerged embittered, claiming he had been punished not for the crime but for daring to defy a powerful corporation. The linemen remember. For the linemen who had maintained the lines through those difficult years, the memory of the wire cutters lingered. Many wrote memoirs or letters describing their endless rides, their brushes with hostile patrols, their fear of shadows moving in the night. One, Henry Lawson, the same lineman, nearly lynched by settlers, later recalled. It was not the cutting itself that gnawed at a man, but the silence that followed. A line gone dead was like a voice choked off. You would sit there with your hand on the key, tapping into nothing, wondering if the world beyond had ended. For them, the episode was a reminder of how fragile their work had been. A nation's lifeline, stretched across miles of prairie, hung by nothing stronger than a thread of iron wire. Impact on communities. Communities along the telegraph routes also bore the imprint of the crisis. For settlers, the episodes underscored how dependent they had become on the flow of words from the east. The sudden isolation when wires went down revealed just how thin the thread of connection was between a frontier town and the rest of the republic. For native communities, the telegraph symbolized intrusion and surveillance. Many Lakota saw it as another instrument of conquest, binding the land with invisible cords. Cutting the wires, even briefly, was both a symbolic and practical act of resistance. Though the Army punished some, the memory of these small victories circulated in oral tradition, reminders that the colonizers' technology was not invincible. Broader historical context. The Dakota wire-cutting crisis was not unique. Across the world in the 19th century, telegraph lines were frequent targets of sabotage. In India during the 1857 rebellion, rebels cut wires to disrupt British command. In the American Civil War, Confederate raiders severed Union lines and sometimes tapped them to read dispatches. Later, in the Boer War, guerrilla fighters did the same to British telegraphs in South Africa. The Dakota episodes fit into this global story. The realization that information itself was a weapon, and that attacking its channels could shift the balance of power. For a few years, on the plains of the American frontier, that struggle played out in the quiet snip of cutters against wire. The decline of the crisis. By the early 1880s, the problem had largely faded. Stronger materials, better patrols, and more established communities reduced opportunities for sabotage. The arrival of railroads brought denser settlement, which made it harder for cutters to act unseen. Moreover, the integration of the telegraph into daily life used by farmers, merchants, and families made it less likely that settlers would tolerate its disruption. What had once seemed a distant corporate tool became a local necessity. The telegraph was no longer an intruder. It was the lifeline of the community. Lasting lessons. The telegraph wire-cutting crisis of Dakota Territory left behind a set of lessons that outlived the iron poles and sagging wires. Communication is fragile. No matter how advanced, systems depend on physical links that can be broken with the simplest tools. Sabotage is a language of resistance. For the marginalized, striking the invisible threads of power can be more potent than striking the people who wield it. Law must adapt. Courts had to grapple with crimes never before imagined, setting precedents that still shape how societies respond to attacks on communication networks. Trust is as vital as technology. For every cut wire, suspicion spread wider than the break itself, fraying communities even more than the line. Reflection. Today, when we think of communication, it is cables under oceans, satellites above the skies, and signals carried invisibly through the air. But in the 1870s, it was just wire stretched across land that was contested, fragile, and vast. And in that wire lay the hope of control, the promise of connection, and the fear of silence. The cutters of Dakota Territory, whether they were native resistors, disgruntled settlers, thieves, or conspirators, exposed a truth still relevant. Our societies hang by threads, and the smallest act can reverberate through an entire nation. And so the question lingers, did the cutters know how much power they wielded when they snipped the wire? Or were they only grasping at fragments of survival in a land where every thread was contested? Story 5. The Post Office Key Forgeries of St. Louis. St. Louis in the 1880s was a city of arrivals. Steamboats puffed at the levee, trains shrieked their way across the Mississippi, and every day sacks of letters poured into the city's sprawling post office, destined for merchants, immigrants, and families scattered across the Midwest. The post office was not merely a building, it was an artery of the Republic. For a nickel, one could reach across miles of prairie or river and speak through paper. For immigrants who had crossed oceans, letters were lifelines to families still in Europe. For traders, the post carried contracts, banknotes, and orders that meant the difference between prosperity and ruin. But in the quiet hum of that postal machinery, something darker stirred, a scheme so intricate, and yet so oddly mundane that it slipped beneath the notice of many for years. The forging of post office keys. The nature of a key. The post office of the era was built on trust. Letter carriers were issued brass keys that opened locked boxes and bags. These keys were sturdy, cut with precision, and closely guarded. A lost key could be disastrous, for it granted access to not just letters, but wealth, money orders, registered parcels, cash sent across states. The assumption was simple. No one outside the postal service could replicate a key. Forging them required skill in metalwork, knowledge of lock mechanisms, and most importantly, access to an original. Yet by the late 1870s, rumors began to drift through postal inspector reports. Forged keys had begun appearing in the Midwest, and the center of this quiet epidemic, investigators soon suspected, was St. Louis. Early suspicions. The first clues came not from missing mail, but from strange irregularities. In small towns outside St. Louis, postmasters reported sacks arriving unsealed, as though they had been tampered with in transit. Letters would be shifted, but not stolen outright. Money orders vanished sporadically, replaced by envelopes of equal weight stuffed with newspaper. In St. Louis itself, a merchant complained that a draft mailed from New York had never reached his bank. An immigrant family swore their remittances to relatives in Bavaria were disappearing mid-route. Each complaint on its own seemed trivial, the kind of thing the Postal Service expected in a system so vast. But together, they hinted at something systematic. The inspectors step in. Postal inspectors were, at the time, among the most feared investigators in America. Unlike local police, they carried federal authority. Their task was not glamorous. They dealt in fraud, theft, and the petty corruptions of the mail, but their reputation for persistence was legendary. By 1880, inspectors in St. Louis had begun compiling the irregularities. Patterns emerged. The thefts seemed to target registered mail most often, suggesting the thieves had precise knowledge of the system. More troubling still, the thefts occurred across multiple routes and districts. No single carrier or clerk could explain them all. This suggested something unusual, a tool that could cross all boundaries, a skeleton key. The locksmith's whisper. Investigators eventually traced a thread to the city's locksmiths. One, pressed under questioning, admitted he had been approached by a man seeking blanks for government locks. The locksmith had refused, fearing prosecution, but the request itself confirmed inspectors' fears. Someone in St. Louis was experimenting with forging postal keys. Unlike ordinary keys, postal keys were cut from government stock, each one carefully recorded and numbered. To reproduce one meant not only access to skilled metalwork, but also inside knowledge of postal lock designs. The circle of suspects narrowed to former employees, blacksmiths, or criminal networks with enough money to fund the experiment. A city of opportunity. St. Louis was fertile ground for such a scheme. With its bustling riverfront and swelling immigrant population, it was a city both wealthy and porous. Graft ran through its politics. Saloons doubled as offices for fixers who could arrange anything for the right price. The post office itself, a grand marble structure on Olive Street, stood as a symbol of federal order, but within it moved clerks and carriers earning modest wages, some tempted by opportunity. Inspectors began discreetly watching saloons, gambling dens, and pawnshops where stolen goods often surfaced. They listened for whispers of letters opened and resealed, of cash converted to coin. Slowly, a picture formed. A ring of men, small-time but audacious, who had discovered a way to forge the very keys of the federal system. The first break. The breakthrough came not in St. Louis, but in a small Missouri town. A carrier reported his satchel had been mysteriously relocked after a delay. Inspectors rushed to examine it and discovered faint scratches on the lock marks of a counterfeit key. This discovery electrified the case. Until then, suspicion had been just that. Now there was proof. Someone had not only forged a key but used it successfully. The quiet thefts were not accidents. They were deliberate, systematic breaches of federal mail security. Public murmurs. News of the thefts began to leak into newspapers. Editors spoke of post office bandits and phantom keymen. Merchants worried that their contracts might vanish in transit. Immigrants fretted over their family remittances. For a city that prided itself on modernity and connection, the idea that the mail was unsafe struck at a deep nerve. The post office tried to calm fears, insisting the system was sound, that inspectors were vigilant. But inside the service, alarm bells rang. If forged keys were circulating, they could spread across the nation. St. Louis was not merely a problem, it was a potential contagion. A question unanswered. By 1881, inspectors had a theory. The forgers had acquired an authentic key, perhaps stolen from a careless carrier or corrupt clerk, and used it as a model. But who had orchestrated it? And how far had the forged keys already spread? The hunt was no longer for missing letters. It was for the shadowy figures who had dared to forge the instruments of federal trust. And as investigators probed deeper, they found themselves drawn into a world where blacksmiths, gamblers, and desperate men converged around one of the strangest and most audacious crimes of the Gilded Age. The locks of the mailbags had been breached. The city of letters trembled, but the true scope of the forgery ring was only beginning to unfold. The discovery of scratches on the Missouri satchel lock gave postal inspectors what they had lacked until then: tangible proof. No longer was this a matter of rumors or scattered complaints. Someone had indeed slipped counterfeit keys into circulation, and if one forged key existed, logic suggested others were already in use. The inspectors moved quickly. They intensified surveillance in St. Louis, dispatched decoys through the mail, and tightened rules on carriers. Yet the thefts continued. Money orders vanished from registered envelopes. Gold certificates disappeared between New York and St. Louis banks. Every missing piece of currency told them the ring was not only alive, but growing bolder. The problem of silence. Unlike highway robbery or bank theft, this crime was quiet. No pistol shots echoed on the streets. No vaults were blown open. Instead, the damage revealed itself days later when letters failed to arrive or parcels appeared suspiciously resealed. By then, the thieves were long gone. For inspectors, this silence was maddening. The thieves moved without spectacle, blending back into the city's bustle. It was crime as shadow, crime as absence, and harder to trace than any gang with guns. Tactics of the inspectors. The inspectors, seasoned in fraud cases, devised an unusual strategy. They created bait letters, envelopes stuffed with marked bills, and sent them along suspected routes. Some were deliberately made to appear valuable, bulging, heavily sealed, bearing the red markings of registered mail. Others mimicked immigrant remittances, modest sums with foreign handwriting. Time and again, the bait letters vanished. When recovered, their seals bore faint impressions of being lifted and repressed. The thieves were careful but not flawless. They had learned to relock the satchels, but the act left subtle traces: tiny brass burrs, faint scratches. The inspectors cataloged each mark like evidence from a crime scene. A suspect emerges. In 1882, suspicion began to focus on a former postal clerk named Henry Marsh. Dismissed for drunkenness, Marsh had once handled keys and registers. Now he was often seen in the company of blacksmiths and gamblers on the city's riverfront. He lived beyond his means, appearing at racetracks with fat rolls of cash. When inspectors shadowed him, they noticed he visited a small workshop late at night. The workshop belonged to a machinist known for fashioning lock picks. Marsh's past employment gave him knowledge of mail procedures. The machinist had the tools. It was enough to place Marsh under surveillance. But suspicion is not evidence. Inspectors knew a prosecution would require catching him in the act, preferably with a forged key in hand. Inside the workshop, an informant, bribed by the inspectors, described what he had seen. Strips of brass heated in the forge, filed into strange shapes, measured against something Marsh carried in his pocket. The informant claimed he once saw Marsh dip a brass blank into black powder to stain it, making it resemble a worn government key. Still, the informant's testimony alone could not secure a conviction. What inspectors needed was the key itself. The breakthrough arrest. The breakthrough came in the summer of 1883. Inspectors arranged a sting at Union Depot. A bait package, marked as containing $1,500 in notes, was sent on a route known to have been targeted. Inspectors shadowed the satchel, watching each hand that touched it. At one point, the satchel disappeared into a side room. Minutes later, it re-emerged, seemingly untouched. But when it arrived at its destination, the package was gone. Inspectors swooped in. Marsh was caught leaving the depot, and in his pocket they found a brass key. At first glance, it seemed legitimate, but its number did not match any issued key. Later examination revealed it was a forgery, filed by hand yet alarmingly precise. The arrest electrified the press. Newspapers trumpeted headlines like, "Key forger nabbed in St. Louis, mail trust restored." But the truth was more complicated. Marsh was just one man, and the thefts did not cease with his capture. The wider ring. In interrogations, Marsh admitted he had not worked alone. He hinted at others who financed the forging, men who provided information on shipments and laundered stolen money through saloons and gambling dens. Inspectors realized they had only skimmed the surface of a larger conspiracy. Following Marsh's leads, they raided workshops and saloons, seizing partially finished keys and filing tools. They uncovered a small but organized ring: former postal workers, skilled machinists, and fence operators. Together, they had built an underground industry devoted to exploiting the mail. The scale shocked the public. For years, letters had been quietly plundered. Thousands of dollars in money orders, drafts, and notes had been siphoned away, often without victims ever realizing their mail had been intercepted. Trial in public drama. Marsh's trial in 1884 became a spectacle. Prosecutors presented the forged key as Exhibit A, holding it before the jury like a weapon. Witnesses described his late-night visits to the machinist, his sudden wealth, his suspicious companions. The press called him the brass skeleton for his role in unlocking the nation's secrets. Marsh's defense argued he had been framed, that the key in his pocket had been planted. But the evidence was damning. The jury convicted him of mail robbery, and he was sentenced to a decade in federal prison. Yet even in victory, inspectors knew the battle was unfinished. Other forged keys were still circulating, and rumors suggested some had already been sold beyond St. Louis, spreading into Illinois and Kentucky. The unresolved puzzle. Marsh behind bars, the machinist disappeared. Some believed he fled west, carrying his tools with him. Others whispered he had been paid to vanish by men higher up the chain. What remained clear was that St. Louis had been the hub of a criminal innovation, the forging of government-issued postal keys. The inspectors now faced a sobering question. How many locks across the nation had already been compromised? And how many men, armed with counterfeit brass, could still reach into the very heart of the mail system? The story was not over. The conviction of Henry Marsh in 1884 was a victory, but it was a brittle one. The forged key in his pocket had been paraded before the jury like a trophy, yet the inspectors who secured his arrest understood something deeper. Marsh was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was systemic vulnerability. Across the United States, thousands of brass satchel locks and their government-issued keys formed the backbone of trust in the mail. The Marsh case had proved beyond doubt that those locks could be copied, and that the most sacred guarantee of postal integrity, that a locked satchel was inviolate, was no longer true. A web still intact. After Marsh's conviction, thefts from registered mail did not stop. Reports continued from Cincinnati, Louisville, and even as far as Memphis. Inspectors suspected that some of Marsh's fellow conspirators had scattered, carrying with them both the knowledge and the tools of forgery. One inspector's report from 1885 noted, grimly, "The locks of the mail are no more secure than a child's toy. Any man with brass and patience may fashion a key, and with it, command the secrets of commerce." This was not paranoia. A raid on a Louisville boarding house uncovered 3 half-finished brass keys, each bearing numbers corresponding to real postal issue. The machinist, perhaps Marsh's old associate, vanished before he could be apprehended. The government's response. Faced with scandal, the Post Office Department acted. It announced the introduction of a new generation of locks more complex in their wards, more difficult to copy. Contracts were awarded to locksmith firms in New England, which promised unforgeable designs. At the same time, inspectors tightened control over existing keys. Carriers were required to sign them in and out each day. Lost keys were to be reported immediately. Surprise inspections multiplied. The culture of trust, once informal, hardened into a regime of oversight. For the public, the reforms were meant to inspire confidence. But inside the department, officials admitted the truth. No lock was truly unforgeable. All they could do was make forgery harder, less profitable, more dangerous. The fate of Henry Marsh. Meanwhile, Marsh himself languished in prison. Letters preserved from his incarceration reveal a man both bitter and resigned. In one, he wrote to a brother, "They call me a thief of letters, but the system is what invited thieves. Had I not done it, another man surely would. Do they think brass is so holy it cannot be copied?" His words, though self-serving, contained an uncomfortable truth. Marsh was punished as an individual, but his crime revealed vulnerabilities no single sentence could erase. He served nearly a decade before being released. After prison, he vanished into anonymity, likely under an assumed name. Whether he returned to forgery or lived quietly is unknown. His trial had made him infamous, but time eroded his notoriety. Broader consequences. The legacy of the St. Louis key forgeries stretched beyond one man. The case reshaped the philosophy of mail security in the United States. Before, theft had been imagined as brute force bandits attacking stagecoaches, burglars cracking safes. After Marsh, the specter of inside knowledge haunted the department. Every new hire was scrutinized more carefully. Inspectors began compiling dossiers not only on suspects but on employees themselves. The post office, once seen as a bastion of civic virtue, became wary of its own staff. Suspicion was institutionalized. The case also influenced legislation. In 1888, Congress expanded the powers of postal inspectors, giving them broader jurisdiction to pursue mail fraud and theft across state lines. Their authority, once narrow, now resembled that of a national police force. Echoes in public memory. To the average citizen, the details of brass forgery faded quickly. Most people remembered only that, for a time, the mail could not be trusted. Mothers hesitated to send money to sons working in distant states. Businesses began insuring correspondence at higher rates. Some banks even preferred telegraph transfers, fearing letters could be intercepted. In taverns and newspapers, the tale of the St. Louis skeleton keys became shorthand for corruption. It was not the blood and thunder of a train robbery, but it was unsettling precisely because it was quiet, hidden, insidious. The end of the affair. By the early 1890s, reports of forged postal keys dwindled. Whether because the new locks were stronger or because the original ring had dissolved, inspectors could not say with certainty. A few isolated cases cropped up, one in Ohio, another in Kansas, but none matched the scale or brazenness of the St. Louis wave. The machinist who had escaped, the shadowy financier Marsh, hinted at these figures slipped into legend. Some said the machinist died in the West, others that he taught his craft to younger thieves. The financier's identity was never confirmed. The story ended, not with resolution but with quiet dispersal. Reflection, crime in the ordinary. The St. Louis key forgeries illustrate something fundamental about crime. It is often not the grand spectacle, but the exploitation of the ordinary that changes systems. The thieves never brandished guns or masks. They wielded brass blanks, files, and patience, yet their actions shook one of the most trusted institutions in America. For you, the listener, it raises a disquieting thought. Every lock, every seal, every guarantee we trust is, at some level, vulnerable. When a system leans too heavily on faith, someone will test it. And when they succeed, the cost is borne not only in money, but in the erosion of trust itself. The post office recovered from the St. Louis scandal. Locks were improved, inspectors grew more powerful, and the flow of letters continued. But in the background remained a question, unanswered then as now. How secure is anything, really, when the key to it can be copied in brass? Story 6. The Gold Dust Swindle of Melbourne. In the 1850s, Melbourne was a city intoxicated by gold. The Victorian gold rush had transformed what was once a modest colonial outpost into one of the richest cities in the British Empire. Ships crowded the harbor with prospectors from across the globe, and streets swelled with bankers, miners, and merchants, each chasing the promise of sudden wealth. Gold did not just arrive in the city as nuggets carried in miners' pouches. Increasingly, it came in the form of gold dust, fine grains sifted from riverbeds and sluices, packed into pouches, bottles, or even tobacco tins. Gold dust was a currency as much as it was a commodity, exchanged in offices, weighed on delicate scales, and turned into sovereigns in the mint. But gold dust carried risks. Unlike nuggets, it could be tampered with. Merchants, bankers, and even miners themselves whispered of dishonest practices. Sand mixed into the glitter, brass filings added for weight, mercury to mimic the sheen. In a city where fortunes could turn on the reliability of a few ounces, the potential for fraud loomed like a storm cloud. It was in this context that one of Melbourne's most unusual and enduring frauds took shape: the gold dust swindle. A growing trade. By 1856, the goldfields of Ballarat and Bendigo were producing staggering amounts of ore. Dust poured into Melbourne daily, carried by miners eager to sell and by agents acting on behalf of distant investors. The city's bullion merchants set up shop near Collins and Elizabeth Streets, their offices filled with gleaming scales, weights, and locked strongboxes. Businessmen in frock coats haggled with men fresh from the diggings, their boots still caked with mud. Trust was essential, yet trust was strained. Newspapers warned constantly of adulteration. One 1857 editorial in the Argus thundered, "We caution our readers, the gold dust offered for sale may not be pure. It behooves the prudent buyer to examine carefully, lest he find himself the fool of fraudsters." Still, trade moved quickly. The sheer volume of dust made detailed scrutiny rare. Merchants relied on glances, hasty weighings, and reputation. It was fertile ground for crime. The first rumors. The swindle began quietly. In late 1858, a series of merchants complained that gold dust purchased in Melbourne seemed strangely light when melted. What had weighed 2 ounces on the scale produced significantly less bullion once smelted. At first, suspicion fell on miners. It was easy enough to imagine a desperate digger padding his pouch with sand. But as complaints multiplied, a pattern emerged. The suspicious dust often came from reputable sellers, even established intermediaries trusted for years. Inspectors at the Melbourne Mint began to grow uneasy. One clerk noted in his ledger, "Several recent deliveries present with impurities not of the usual kind. Metallic grains present, yet not consistent with known alloys." The problem was subtle, but it was spreading. The swindle unmasked. By 1859, inspectors uncovered the trick. The dust had been adulterated not with ordinary dirt, but with finely ground iron pyrites, fool's gold. Pyrites glittered with a golden sheen, indistinguishable at a glance from real dust. Ground to a powder, it could be mixed into genuine gold with remarkable effectiveness. On the scales, it added weight. To the eye, it added sparkle. Only when melted did it betray itself, producing black slag instead of bullion. The genius of the fraud lay in its invisibility. Ordinary merchants, lacking chemical tests or time for close inspection, had no way to distinguish adulterated dust from pure. Even the mint required careful assaying to prove the deceit. The operators, the culprits, investigators believed, were not poor miners but organized swindlers operating within Melbourne itself. They purchased small quantities of legitimate dust, then mixed in pyrites ground by machinists. The adulterated product was repackaged and sold back into the market, sometimes even to the same merchants who had sold the original dust. A few names surfaced in whispers. One was Patrick O'Connell, a known fence with ties to both miners and pawnbrokers. Another was a chemist rumored to have supplied the equipment for grinding pyrites, but concrete proof was scarce. The trade in dust was fast-moving, and once adulterated pouches entered circulation, tracing them back was nearly impossible. Public alarm. News of the fraud spread rapidly. The Melbourne Age declared, "A fraud most insidious has taken root among us. It threatens not only the fortunes of individuals but the credit of our colony itself. Who will purchase our dust abroad if it is thought to be false?" Merchants panicked. Buyers began refusing dust unless it came from trusted sources. Some demanded it be melted and assayed before payment, a costly delay in a city where time meant profit. Miners, furious, claimed their honest work was being tainted by fraudsters in the city. "We toil in the mud," one wrote to the paper, "yet it is in Melbourne where the cheats are born." The government, fearing damage to Victoria's reputation, pledged an inquiry. The inquiry begins. In early 1860, a panel of officials, merchants, and mint officers convened to investigate. They examined dust samples, interviewed traders, and tried to map the flow of adulterated gold. The results were alarming. Dozens of merchants admitted they had been defrauded, though few wished to speak publicly. The total losses, while hard to calculate, were estimated in the tens of thousands of pounds, a staggering sum in a colony still only a few decades old. The inquiry confirmed what many feared. The fraud was not the work of isolated cheats, but of a coordinated ring, supplying doctored dust on a scale large enough to destabilize confidence in Melbourne's gold market. Yet the panel faced a problem. Without catching the adulteration in progress, the perpetrators remained shadows. Suspicion alone was not enough for prosecution. A growing unease. As the inquiry dragged on, so did the fraud. Merchants became increasingly paranoid, and transactions slowed. Some buyers withdrew from the dust market altogether, preferring to deal only in minted coins or large nuggets. The city, once intoxicated with gold fever, began to feel the hangover. Whispers of corruption spread. Foreign investors grew wary. The fraud was no longer just a crime, it was a threat to Melbourne's prosperity. And yet, as the 1860s opened, the swindle remained unsolved. The gold dust swindle was only beginning. In the next section, we'll explore the investigative twists, the desperate attempts to trap the swindlers, and the scandals that threatened to engulf Melbourne's financial elite. By 1861, the gold dust swindle had become Melbourne's most whispered-about scandal. Merchants distrusted one another, prospectors muttered about betrayal, and government officials wrestled with the prospect that an entire colony's reputation for honesty in trade was at stake. Yet the culprits remained elusive, protected by the very nature of their fraud. Investigators in a fog. The colonial government, under mounting pressure, ordered more vigorous investigations. Detectives from the fledgling Victoria Police were dispatched to canvass merchants, miners, and transport agents. They seized samples of dust and carried them to the Melbourne Mint for testing. The assays told a grim story. At least 1 in every 4 samples contained impurities, most commonly pyrites but occasionally sand, brass shavings, or even powdered lead. Some mixtures were so sophisticated that only careful chemical treatment revealed the truth. But when detectives tried to trace adulterated dust back to its cellars, they hit walls. Merchants insisted they purchased honestly from miners. Miners swore they sold pure dust to merchants. In the rapid transactions of Melbourne's Gold Quarter, accountability dissolved like smoke. The investigators grew convinced they were not chasing a handful of opportunists, but a professionalized ring, strategically inserting their adulterated dust into circulation. The suspected ring. Rumors centered on a group of men tied loosely to Melbourne's underworld. Among them was Patrick O'Connell, the pawnbroker and fence mentioned in Section 1, whose shop near Little Burke Street was notorious for moving stolen goods. O'Connell was seen often in the company of miners, chemists, and suspicious middlemen who loitered in the taverns along Flinders Lane. Another figure was Edward Hanratty, a machinist with a sideline in chemical supplies. Hanratty was rumored to operate grinding equipment capable of reducing pyrites to dust so fine it could blend seamlessly with gold. Though he claimed his business catered only to legitimate industrial clients, whispers suggested otherwise. Finally, there was Sarah "Sally" Kerrigan, a shrewd boarding house owner. Investigators suspected she acted as a broker, introducing miners flush with gold to buyers who were part of the swindle. Some officers even believed Kerrigan stored adulterated dust in her establishment, swapping pure samples for mixed ones before resale. No single name could be proved, but together, these suspects formed a shadowy constellation in the city's gold economy. Merchants pushed back. As the inquiry deepened, Melbourne's bullion merchants took matters into their own hands. A group led by George Withers, a respected Collins Street trader, formed a private association to combat fraud. They pooled resources to hire independent assiers and began sharing intelligence on suspicious transactions. Minutes from one of their meetings, preserved in newspaper accounts, reveal the anxiety. It is intolerable that honest men should be undone by rogues. If the government cannot protect us, then we must protect ourselves. Let none hereafter purchase without testing, and let none harbor the known cheats. Some merchants installed improved balances, hoping more sensitive equipment would catch adulteration. Others began demanding that miners sell only to their regular buyers. Still, the swindlers adapted. Each new precaution was met with subtler deceit. A sting attempt. In 1862, police attempted a sting. An undercover constable posed as a gullible merchant newly arrived from Sydney. He spread word in taverns that he was eager to buy gold dust quickly, no questions asked. Within weeks, he was approached by an intermediary offering a pouch at a bargain price. The pouch glittered convincingly, but assays later revealed it was nearly 30% pyrites. The seller, however, disappeared into Melbourne's crowded lanes before he could be apprehended. Investigators believed he was a low-level runner for the swindlers, a disposable link in the chain. The sting demonstrated the fraud's boldness, but failed to bring its masterminds to justice. Scandal in the Mint. By 1863, suspicion reached even the Melbourne Mint itself. Some merchants whispered that dishonest employees might be complicit, allowing adulterated dust to slip into official channels. The government launched an internal review. Though no evidence of corruption was proven, the investigation highlighted another problem. The Mint lacked both the manpower and the technology to scrutinize every delivery thoroughly. Staff were overworked, and chemical assays took time. In the rush to keep the city's economy flowing, shortcuts were inevitable. Critics argued that this laxity gave swindlers confidence. If even the Mint could be fooled, what chance did ordinary merchants have? Social fallout. As years passed without resolution, the fraud began to corrode Melbourne's social fabric. Honest miners grew resentful of city elites who, they believed, failed to defend their reputations. Merchants accused one another of complicity, sowing mistrust among men who once dealt in handshakes. Even ordinary citizens felt the effects. Newspapers warned that adulteration might drive down gold's price abroad, weakening Victoria's prosperity. The dishonor of a few cheats, thundered the age, may ruin the honest industry of thousands. A public meeting at St. Patrick's Hall drew hundreds, many demanding harsher punishments for those caught. One fiery speaker declared, "We hang bushrangers for robbing a coach. Shall we do less for those who rob the colony itself with their powders and poisons?" A breakthrough or a mirage? By 1864, investigators finally caught a glimmer of hope. A delivery of dust seized en route to a Collins Street merchant contained unusually high levels of pyrites. Tracing its origin, police discovered it had passed through the hands of Hanratty, the machinist. Hanratty was arrested and charged with fraud. The newspapers erupted, portraying him as the likely mastermind of the entire swindle. Crowds gathered outside his trial, eager for justice. But the case collapsed. Hanratty insisted he had sold grinding equipment, not adulterated dust. The prosecution could not prove otherwise. Without eyewitnesses or direct evidence, the jury acquitted him. The acquittal was a devastating blow. Many concluded the swindlers were untouchable. The fraud evolves. Frustrated investigators noticed something troubling. The adulteration itself was changing. Instead of coarse mixtures easily spotted under a magnifying glass, the new samples used powdered alloys blended so smoothly with real gold that even experts struggled to separate them. Some suspected that chemists were now involved, supplying substances designed to mimic gold's density and color more precisely. The fraud, once crude, had become almost scientific. This evolution suggested something chilling. The swindle was not dying, it was maturing. A city grows weary. By the late 1860s, the gold dust swindle had lost some of its shock but none of its sting. It persisted like a chronic illness never fatal to Melbourne's economy, but never cured. Merchants grew cautious, miners disillusioned, and officials embarrassed. For many, it became less a crime to be solved than a condition to be endured. New regulations tightened gold transactions, but loopholes remained. The swindlers, whoever they were, adapted and survived. Yet beneath the weary acceptance lay an unspoken question. If this fraud could continue unchecked for years, what else might flourish in Melbourne's shadows? The swindle was far from over. In the next section, we will examine its long-term consequences, the lessons it left for financial regulation, and the mystery of why no mastermind was ever definitively unmasked. By the 1870s, Melbourne had matured from a feverish gold rush town into a city of stone banks, theaters, and iron bridges. Its skyline grew taller, its streets busier, its reputation more secure. Yet in the background, the old whispers of the gold dust swindle never fully faded. They remained like a scar half-healed but always visible to those who looked closely. Regulators respond. In 1871, the colonial government enacted stricter bullion laws, requiring merchants to register every transaction above a certain value and to submit random samples for testing at the Melbourne Mint. Customs officers were given greater authority to inspect exports, and police expanded their surveillance of known fences and underworld figures. These measures helped to reduce the swindle's scope, but they did not eradicate it. Instead, they forced it into subtler forms. Traders learned to dilute gold in smaller increments, spreading risk across multiple sales. Others shifted to smuggling adulterated dust overseas, where detection was less likely. The lesson was clear. Crime did not vanish under pressure, it adapted. The fate of the suspects. The names once whispered as suspects drifted into obscurity. Patrick O'Connell, the pawnbroker, was eventually arrested for unrelated stolen goods and served a brief sentence. Upon release, he disappeared from Melbourne's records, perhaps fleeing to Sydney or abroad. Edward Hanratty, the machinist, continued his trade in grinding equipment but remained dogged by suspicion. Some claimed he emigrated to America, where gold scams of similar design later appeared. Sarah Sally Kerrigan, the boarding house owner, died in 1875. When her estate was inventoried, police noted curious quantities of chemical powders, though no one could prove their connection to adulteration. None of them were ever formally convicted for the swindle. History left them as shadows, possible players in a game that was never fully exposed. Public memory. For the miners who once swarmed Victoria's fields, the swindle became a tale told with equal parts anger and resignation. Letters preserved in archives show prospectors warning newcomers, "Guard your dust well, for the city has many ways of cheating you." Merchants, meanwhile, grew cautious to the point of paranoia. By the late 1870s, most refused to buy dust without direct ties to known miners or trusted intermediaries. Some even abandoned the trade entirely, preferring bullion bars or coinage whose purity could be certified. The fraud thus reshaped Melbourne's economy, pushing it toward more formalized systems of exchange. Ironically, the very deceit that threatened the colony's prosperity also accelerated its modernization. A global echo. The gold dust swindle was not unique to Melbourne. Reports from California, South Africa, and even India described similar schemes in which unscrupulous traders adulterated dust with worthless minerals. Historians later argued that Melbourne's experience was part of a global pattern. Wherever gold dust circulated as currency, fraud followed. Without standardized minting, trust was fragile, and criminals exploited every gap. What made Melbourne's case distinctive was its scale and persistence. Few other colonies endured a fraud so long, or allowed its perpetrators to remain so thoroughly hidden. Investigators regret. Old detectives who once chased the swindlers looked back with bitterness. In an 1889 interview, retired Inspector James Murray admitted, "We knew they were there. We could smell the deceit, but we could not seize it in our hands. The merchants wanted arrests, the miners wanted justice, and we could give them neither. The crime slipped always through our nets like dust itself." This candid admission captured the helplessness of law enforcement at the time. Without modern forensic tools, investigators relied on eyewitnesses, confessions, or clumsy chemical assays. Against professional fraudsters, it was rarely enough. The broader impact. Beyond economics, the swindle left deeper marks. It eroded trust at a formative moment in Melbourne's history. Citizens who once believed their colony's wealth was unassailable learned that prosperity could be poisoned from within. Some scholars suggest this suspicion shaped Melbourne's culture in subtle ways. The city became wary of outsiders, skeptical of easy profits, and obsessed with documentation and verification. The great Victorian bureaucracy, with its endless forms and seals, may owe something to the lingering fear of being swindled again. Legends and speculation. Even as the swindle faded, it grew into legend. Folk tales claimed entire fortunes were built on adulterated dust. Others suggested a cabal of chemists, operating secretly beneath the city, orchestrated the fraud for decades. A few even whispered that prominent merchants themselves were complicit, hiding behind their reputations while profiting from deceit. Such theories were never proven, but they endured in the city's imagination because the truth was never fully known. The final consequence. By the 1890s, the gold dust swindle was no longer an active scandal. Melbourne had moved on, its economy diversified, its banks more powerful than individual gold dealers. Yet the swindle left one undeniable legacy. It proved that crime could shape a city's destiny not through violence, but through the erosion of trust. In a world where gold itself could be corrupted, no transaction was safe without vigilance. This realization rippled outward, influencing not only Melbourne but other colonies that watched and learned. Reflection. As you listen to this story, you may wonder, why does the gold dust swindle still matter? After all, the sums involved, though large for their time, pale beside later frauds. The answer lies in what it revealed about human nature. The swindle was not an act of desperate bandits, but of calculated opportunists who understood that confidence is currency. If people believe in gold, then gold has value. Undermine that belief, and you undermine an entire society's foundation. The swindle forced Melbourne to confront that uncomfortable truth, and in doing so, it left a lesson for every generation that followed. So the next time you hear of a scandal, financial or otherwise, consider this. Are we still living in the shadow of that old fraud, still vulnerable to the subtle adulterations of trust? Story 7. The Case of the Phantom Streetcar Conductor. A city in transition. In the early years of the 20th century, Toronto was a city on the move. Its population had surged past 200,000, and its streets echoed with the clang of bells and the rumble of electric streetcars. The Toronto Railway Company, privately owned but publicly vital, operated hundreds of cars daily, ferrying clerks, laborers, and shoppers from one neighborhood to the next. The electric streetcar was more than transportation. It was a symbol of modernity, of a city eager to keep pace with New York, Chicago, and London. Fares were cheap, schedules were reliable, and conductors were uniformed guardians of order, selling tickets, maintaining discipline, and keeping watch on the flow of passengers. So when rumors spread in 1911 of a streetcar that ran without a conductor, it unsettled the city in unexpected ways. The first report. The first official account came from a passenger named Margaret Llewellyn, a dressmaker who boarded a late-night car near St. Clair Avenue. She recalled buying a ticket at the front as usual, but when she moved toward the back she noticed something odd. The conductor's stool was empty. No uniformed man stood watch, no ticket punch rattled. Yet the car continued its journey, stopping dutifully at intersections and opening its doors for new riders. Passengers exchanged nervous glances but said nothing. Each assumed the conductor had stepped away briefly. But when the ride ended, the car emptied and still no conductor appeared. Margaret told her landlord the next morning. He dismissed it as nonsense. But within weeks, other passengers whispered similar tales. A pattern emerges. By spring, reports reached the Toronto Daily Star. The paper ran a short item buried on page 4. Streetcar anomaly baffles riders. It described several incidents in which late-night passengers claimed their car lacked a conductor. Some said they rode for miles without seeing a single uniformed employee. The company dismissed the stories as mistakes. Conductors may be momentarily absent, a spokesman said, perhaps attending to duties in another part of the car. But passengers were insistent. Entire journeys had been made in silence, fares uncollected, rules unenforced. It was as if the car itself ran on unseen orders. Fear and fascination. The public response was mixed. Some treated the accounts as entertainment, telling jokes about Toronto's ghost conductors. Others grew uneasy, worrying that the absence of a conductor meant disorder or worse, danger. Streetcars at the time were not just vehicles, they were tightly managed spaces. Conductors prevented fights, kept drunks under control, and ensured women felt safe traveling alone. Without that presence, passengers feared vulnerability. At the same time, the mystery captured imaginations. Was this a trick, a labor protest, or something stranger, a phantom conductor haunting the tracks? The company investigates. Under pressure, the Toronto Railway Company launched an internal investigation. Inspectors rode cars at random, especially on routes where complaints were common. At first, nothing unusual occurred. Conductors were present, uniforms crisp, tickets punched. But then, in June 1911, an inspector himself reported boarding a car on the Carlton line and finding no conductor in sight. He watched in astonishment as the motorman drove on, oblivious to the missing staff. The inspector demanded an explanation at the car house the next morning. The motorman swore he had worked with a conductor all night, a man named Thomas Riley, a 6-year veteran. Riley himself insisted he had been on duty, collecting fares as usual. But the inspector was adamant. The car had been conductorless. A question of reality. The incident deepened the puzzle. Were passengers hallucinating? Were conductors shirking their duties and hiding? Or was some subtler trick at play? Newspapers fanned speculation. Editorials asked whether the railway was cutting corners, perhaps running cars without full crews to save money. Rival papers accused the company of dishonesty, while spiritualist circles in Toronto whispered that the city had a genuine haunting on its rails. For ordinary Torontonians, the truth was less important than the effect. People began avoiding late-night cars. Women in particular demanded escorts rather than risk riding alone on what some now called the Phantom Line. The shadow of labor strife. Beneath the mystery lay another tension. The city's streetcar workers were restive. Wages were low, hours were long, and the union movement was gaining strength. Conductors and motormen had staged small protests before, and by 1911 larger strikes loomed. Some speculated that the phantom conductor was no ghost at all, but a form of quiet resistance, workers deliberately disappearing, abandoning their posts to embarrass the company. If true, it was a subtle rebellion, one that preyed not on management directly but on the public's trust. Each empty stool, each unanswered fare was a reminder that without workers' loyalty, the system could collapse. Unanswered questions. By late summer, the mystery had not been resolved. Incidents continued sporadically enough to keep the public wary, but not frequent enough to provide conclusive proof. The company denied wrongdoing, the police dismissed ghost stories, and the union remained silent. Passengers, however, could not ignore what they had seen. Too many witnesses, too many journeys made in eerie silence, too many accounts that aligned. Something was happening on Toronto's streetcars, something the official explanations failed to cover. And so, as autumn fell over the city, the case of the phantom conductor remained suspended between reality and rumor, between crime and folklore. The question lingered. Was this a labor trick, a corporate scandal, or a true mystery rolling through Toronto's streets? Growing alarm. By October of 1911, Toronto's phantom conductor mystery had crossed from curiosity into civic embarrassment. Newspapers that once joked about ghost cars now ran sharp critiques of the Toronto Railway Company, TRC. Letters to editors accused the firm of risking public safety, while rival politicians seized the chance to demand municipal oversight of the privately run system. The company, desperate to protect its reputation, doubled down on denials. Officials insisted every car was fully staffed, that inspectors had verified compliance, and that any passenger who claimed otherwise must have been mistaken. Yet the complaints continued. A secretary riding home late from her office on Queen Street swore she rode 5 full stops before realizing no conductor had asked for her fare. A group of factory workers on the Bathurst line said they boarded after midnight, sat through their entire journey, and never once saw a ticket punch. The pattern was undeniable, and so, for the first time, the TRC invited the police into the matter. Police involvement. Inspector James O'Reilly, a seasoned officer with a reputation for skepticism, was tasked with the investigation. He began by riding incognito on various routes, accompanied by plainclothes constables. On his first few attempts, everything seemed ordinary. Conductors were present, fares collected, duties performed. O'Reilly began to suspect the stories were exaggerated, perhaps fueled by the labor unrest that was stirring across the city. But then came November 3, 1911, a night that altered his view. Riding on a Parliament Street car, O'Reilly noticed, halfway through the journey, that the conductor was simply gone. "I had seen him at departure," O'Reilly later testified. "He stood at the rear, uniform tidy, tickets in hand. But some 15 minutes later I realized he was no longer there. The stool was empty, his lamp dark, and no fares were collected for the remainder of the trip." The motorman insisted afterward that his partner had been on board the whole time. Yet O'Reilly, known for his blunt honesty, was adamant. A city divided. The inspector's testimony electrified the press. If a senior policeman had witnessed the phenomenon, then surely it was no mass delusion. But what exactly did it mean? 3 competing theories emerged. Dereliction of duty. Conductors were abandoning their posts, perhaps slipping away for a drink or rest. Corporate deception. The TRC was quietly running some cars without conductors to cut labor costs, instructing motormen to deny it if asked. Something stranger, the absence was too complete, too sudden, leading some to whisper again of hauntings or even more bizarre explanations. Each theory had passionate supporters. Politicians who favored municipal ownership of transit pushed the second explanation, eager to portray the company as untrustworthy. Union leaders hinted at the first, though they refused to admit any coordinated action. And spiritualists, always eager for validation, clung to the third. The truth, it seemed, lay frustratingly out of reach. Eyewitness contradictions. The investigation was further complicated by conflicting witness statements. On the same night, O'Reilly swore the conductor vanished. Another passenger on the same car insisted he saw the man clearly, moving among the riders and collecting tickets. A group of college students claimed to have boarded a conductorless car, only for one of them to later confess they had been drinking heavily and perhaps exaggerated. In another case, a widow said she saw the conductor disappear, like smoke into air, a claim dismissed by officials as hysteria. These contradictions made it impossible to pin down a single explanation. The phantom conductor seemed to exist in a liminal space, both real and unreal, present and absent. The union silence. Behind the scenes, the Street Railwaymen's Union watched closely. They were preparing for a broader strike, and rumors of phantom conductors gave them leverage. If the company's service was unreliable, it strengthened the workers' case for better conditions. Yet union leaders refused to claim responsibility. To do so would admit deliberate sabotage, a dangerous move at a time when public sympathy was still uncertain. Instead, they allowed the rumors to swirl, a tool they could wield without fingerprints. Privately, some suspected the phenomenon was indeed a tactic, conductors briefly abandoning posts in coordinated intervals, making it seem as if cars ran empty. But if that were true, it was executed with uncanny discipline. No worker ever admitted participation, not even decades later. Public backlash. By winter, the public had grown restless. Letters flooded City Hall, demanding answers. Women's associations petitioned for safer streetcars, warning that the absence of conductors endangered female passengers. Business groups complained of lost trade as people avoided night travel. The phantom conductor scandal, as the Star now called it, was no longer a curiosity but a matter of civic order. In December, the city threatened to revoke the TRC's franchise unless it could prove its cars were fully manned. The company scrambled, hiring extra inspectors, documenting staff shifts, and parading conductors before journalists. For a few weeks, reports of phantom cars dwindled. It seemed perhaps the crisis had passed. But had it? Then, on January 14, 1912, the phenomenon returned with startling force. A packed car on the Yonge line carried nearly 40 passengers. Several swore the conductor had been present when they boarded but vanished halfway through the journey. For 3 full miles, no tickets were collected, no voice called stops. When the car reached the depot, the conductor appeared again confused, sweating, and claiming he had been on board the entire time. Passengers were outraged. Some shouted fraud, others muttered of hauntings. The papers seized the story, running headlines the next morning. Phantom returns, entire car testifies. The scandal was alive again, larger than ever. The inspector's dilemma. Inspector O'Reilly found himself caught in the middle. He had no evidence of crime, only testimonies of absence. He could not charge the TRC with fraud, nor the workers with dereliction, without proof. And yet he could not dismiss what he himself had witnessed. His dilemma reflected the larger problem. The case straddled the line between crime and folklore, between labor dispute and urban legend. The phantom conductor was both too real to ignore and too vague to prosecute. By February, the city was at an impasse. Public outrage grew louder, yet no authority could resolve the matter. And so the question remained: was Toronto witnessing corruption, sabotage, or something stranger still? Escalation into crisis. By March of 1912, the phantom conductor affair had consumed Toronto's civic imagination. It was no longer a matter of gossip among late-night writers, it was now a full-blown political issue, threatening both the Toronto Railway Company, TRC, and the fragile trust between citizens and their transportation system. Passengers began to resist paying fares outright. "Why should we pay?" one man was quoted in the Globe, "if the conductor may simply vanish and we receive no service?" Others carried newspapers, ready to record their own testimonies should they board an afflicted car. The TRC's revenue fell noticeably during these months, prompting company directors to accuse newspapers of inciting hysteria. But the truth was simpler. Ordinary people were beginning to distrust the very mechanics of the streetcar system. And without trust, a transit network falters. Theories take hold. As spring arrived, so too did competing narratives about the phantom conductor. The sabotage hypothesis. Union sympathizers whispered that the disappearances were a form of protest, a subtle strike without ever declaring one. If conductors abandoned their posts in unison, even for only part of a journey, it would both confuse the company and enrage passengers. Yet, crucially, no man could be pinned with dereliction. The fraud hypothesis. Political opponents of the TRC insisted this was a corporate plot. By quietly reducing staff at odd hours, the company could pocket more profit, all while claiming it was passengers' imaginations at fault. The supernatural hypothesis. And then there were the spiritualists, growing louder in pamphlets and church basements. They argued that Toronto's expansion had disturbed older burial grounds, unleashing restless spirits. The phantom conductor, they claimed, was no man at all but a haunting presence that mocked the industrial age. Each theory found its audience. Each was both impossible to prove and impossible to fully dismiss. Inspector O'Reilly's last attempt. In April, Inspector James O'Reilly resolved to end the affair. He requested a full week of undercover duty, writing a dozen lines at random hours. On the third night, he claimed to witness something that shook even his seasoned nerves. Riding a car along King Street, he watched the conductor move between passengers, collecting fares. Then, midway through the journey, he blinked and the man was gone. Passengers muttered. Some swore they too had seen the man vanish. Yet when the car pulled into the terminal, there he was again, uniformed, pale, clutching his ticket punch. The conductor swore he had never left. O'Reilly recorded the incident in his official log, but refused to speculate further. To colleagues, he confided only that something deeply wrong lies beneath this business, and I am powerless to name it. It was his final report on the matter. Soon after, he was reassigned. The slow dissipation. By summer of 1912, the frequency of phantom sightings began to fade. Whether due to stricter oversight, wanting hysteria, or some other unseen reason, reports dwindled. By autumn, the papers had moved on to fresh scandals, labor strikes, political quarrels, new technological marvels. But for those who had lived through it, the memory lingered. The phantom conductor had haunted not only the cars, but the imagination of the city. Long-term consequences. Though never solved, the affair carried lasting impacts. Transit oversight. Public outrage forced the city to demand greater accountability from the TRC. Within a decade, Toronto had moved toward municipal ownership of transit, a transformation partly fueled by the mistrust sown in 1911-12. Labor solidarity. The Phantom scandal emboldened conductors and motormen, who realized how easily public opinion could be swayed by doubts in the system. The Street Railwaymen's Union grew stronger in the years that followed. Cultural memory. Spiritualists and storytellers seized the tale, retelling it as proof that the industrial world could not banish the mysteries of the old. Even into the 1930s, older Torontonians recalled the ghost cars of their youth. Folklore. The phantom conductor slipped into legend. Children told each other that late at night, if you rode alone, you might glimpse a vanished man's lantern glowing faintly in the aisle. A vanishing without end. In the end, the case of the phantom conductor was never solved. No single culprit identified, no official explanation accepted. Instead, it occupied that uneasy space where crime, labor, and legend intertwine. Was it coordinated sabotage, a clever fraud, or a mass hallucination shaped by urban tension? Or was it, as some insisted until their dying days, something stranger, an echo of the dead, briefly glimpsed in the glow of a streetcar lamp? We cannot say. We can only note that for one restless year, Toronto's citizens shared a mystery that rattled their faith in both machines and men. And perhaps that is the truest lesson, that trust in everyday order is fragile, and that even a vanished conductor can shake the confidence of an entire city.